Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Name She Cannot Say, from Marcus Chen. The radio crackled to life at exactly 11:47 p.m., just as it had every night for the past 3 weeks. Static filled my cab, mixing with the steady thrum of my Peterbilt's engine as I rolled through the empty stretches of Interstate 80, somewhere between the Nevada-Utah border, where the world feels forgotten by civilization itself. The dispatcher's voice emerged from the white noise, soft and hesitant, carrying that familiar stutter that had become as much a part of my nighttime routine as the coffee growing cold in my cup holder. Unit 77. "This is Base," came the voice, sweet and uncertain. "We have a pickup for you in Salt Lake City. Destination is The voice faltered, struggling with whatever name she was trying to pronounce. Meridian. No, that's not Montgomery. Yes, Montgomery, Alabama. I'd been driving commercial routes for 15 years, long enough to know that most dispatchers were gruff, no-nonsense types who could rattle off addresses and route numbers like auctioneers. But this girl, whoever she was, spoke with the careful deliberation of someone perpetually afraid of making mistakes. Her stutter wasn't severe, just noticeable enough to make her sound vulnerable in a way that tugged at something protective in my chest. "Copy that, Base," I responded, adjusting my headset. "This is Unit 77. What's the nature of the cargo?" A pause stretched across the airwaves, filled only by the ambient hiss of long-distance radio transmission. The manifest says, FF Furniture, antique furniture. Another hesitation. "The pickup is at, this is a difficult one, at BBB Bartholomew and SS. She took a shaky breath. "St. Sebastian Street." Something cold traced its way down my spine, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the way she struggled with those particular names, or the odd formal quality of the address. Most pickup locations were warehouses or loading docks, places with simple functional names. Bartholomew and St. Sebastian sounded like something from an old European city, not the industrial outskirts of Salt Lake. "You got a contact number for the client?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be complicated. "Yes, the contact is..." Her voice grew smaller, more uncertain. Malachai KK." A frustrated sigh whispered through the static. "I'm sorry, I can't seem to get his last name right. It's very long and foreign. The number is on your manifest." The highway stretched ahead of me like a black river, my headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the darkness. Mountains rose on either side, their peaks invisible in the starless night. I'd driven this route countless times, but tonight it felt different, as though the landscape itself was holding its breath. "What's your name, dispatch?" I found myself asking. "I've been getting these late-night runs for weeks now, and you're always the one handling them." Silence stretched so long I thought the connection had died. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, they call me SSSS Chera, with an H. She paused. "But that's not, I think that's not quite right either. Names are so hard for me lately." A semi-truck passed me, going the opposite direction, its lights briefly illuminating my cab, before vanishing into the night. In that moment of brightness, I could have sworn I saw someone sitting in my passenger seat, but when darkness returned, I was alone. The radio remained quiet, and I began to wonder if Sarah was still there. Sarah, you okay?" I asked. "I'm here," she replied, but her voice seemed to come from farther away now, as though she were speaking into the microphone from across a large room. Marcus, isn't it? Marcus. C. She struggled with my last name, though it was simple enough. "That's funny, I used to know someone with that name." A long time ago, I hadn't told her my name. It would be on the dispatch log, of course, but something about the way she said it, with that familiar hesitation, made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The engine's steady rumble seemed to grow quieter, as though the truck itself was straining to listen. "How long have you been working dispatch, Sarah?" I'm not I don't really remember starting, she said. It feels like I've always been here, taking the late calls, trying to get the names right. There are so many names, and they're all so difficult. Sometimes I think if I could just say one perfectly, just once, then maybe what? And no response. The radio hissed with empty static, and I began to climb into the foothills approaching Salt Lake City. The lights of civilization twinkled below, but they seemed distant and cold, like stars reflected in black water. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, though I could have sworn I'd started the night with a full tank. 20 minutes later, the radio crackled back to life. Unit 77. There's been a change to your pickup location. Go ahead, Sarah. The new address is... Oh dear. Her voice trembled with frustration. C. Calvary. No, that's not right. Calverton Street and PPP. She made a sound like sobbing. I can never get this one. Purgatory Avenue. The cold in my spine spread outward, numbing my arms. Sarah, those street names, are you sure that's right? The client's name has changed too, she continued, as if she hadn't heard me. Now it says it's Mortimer D. A long pause filled with what might have been breathing, or wind, or something else entirely. I wish I could say it. I wish I could say just one name, the way it's supposed to be said. I was entering the city limits now, following my GPS, through increasingly narrow streets that didn't match the major highways I usually took for pickups. The buildings here were older, with architectural details that seemed to shift and blur when I wasn't looking directly at them. Street lamps flickered with an odd greenish light that made everything look underwater. Sarah, I'm having trouble finding these streets. Can you give me some landmarks? You should see it soon, she whispered. The old church with no name on the sign, the cemetery where all the headstones are turned backward. The antique shop with the mirror in the window that shows. Her voice dissolved into static. I turned down a street that seemed narrower than it should be, lined with buildings that pressed close to the road like curious faces. At the intersection ahead, I could see a street sign for Calverton, though the letters seemed to wiggle and rearrange themselves when I tried to read them clearly. What does the mirror show, Sarah? It shows the names, she said, and for the first time her voice was clear without a trace of stuttering. All the names I've tried so hard to say, they're written there, perfectly spelled, perfectly clear, and behind them I can see myself, but not the way I am now, the way I was before I forgot how to say my own name. I turned onto what my GPS claimed was Purgatory Avenue, though the street sign was too corroded to read. Halfway down the block sat a narrow building squeezed between two others, with a single flickering neon sign that read Antiques. In the large front window, I could see the edge of an ornate mirror, its surface dark and reflective. I'm at the pickup location, I said into the radio. But Sarah, I don't think I should. You have to, she interrupted, and her stutter was back worse than before. Please, Marcus. I've been trying to say your name right for so long. If you could just look in the mirror and tell me what you see. Tell me if my name is really SS Sarah, or if it's something else, something I've forgotten. I sat in my idling truck, staring at the antique shop. Nothing moved on the street. No other vehicles, no pedestrians, no lights in any of the surrounding buildings. The mirror in the window seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence, and I had the unsettling feeling that if I looked into it, I would see more than just my own reflection. Sarah, how long have you been here? Really? I don't know, she whispered. Time moves differently when you can't say the words. The Rain Road Convoy. From Marcus Del Rio. The first drops hit my windshield. Just outside of Bakersfield, fat droplets that caught the amber glow of my headlights before spreading into long streaks across the glass. I'd been driving the same route between Los Angeles and Sacramento for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture in my 97 Kenworth, and I knew every mile of Highway 99 like the lines on my weathered hands. But there was something different about that October night, something that made the rain feel heavier than it should have, more deliberate somehow, as if it was falling just for me. The CB radio crackled with static as I reached for the windshield wiper controls, the familiar voices of other drivers fading in and out between bursts of white noise. Weather reports had called for clear skies, yet here I was watching storm clouds roll across the Central Valley like a dark blanket being pulled over the world. My diesel engine hummed its steady rhythm beneath me, 18 wheels rolling smooth over wet asphalt that reflected my running lights in rippling patterns. 2 pairs of them, following at a respectful distance, their beams cutting through the rain with an unusual intensity. Nothing strange about that, of course. Truckers often traveled together for safety, especially on lonely stretches like this one, where the highway cut through endless fields of cotton and almond trees. But as I watched those lights in my side mirror, wiping condensation from the glass with my sleeve, something about their precise spacing and unwavering distance struck me as oddly mechanical, too perfect for human drivers fighting fatigue and wet. The rain intensified, drumming against my cab with increasing urgency, and I had to slow down as visibility dropped. My wipers worked overtime, squeaking slightly on their return stroke, a sound that began to match the rhythm of my heartbeat for reasons I couldn't explain. That's when I saw the third set of headlights join the formation behind me, then a fourth, then a fifth, each one falling into perfect alignment with the other. Through my passenger mirror, I could make out the silhouettes of what appeared to be identical trucks, their chrome bumpers and grills gleaming wetly in the darkness. Breaker 19. This is Cargo King heading northbound at mile marker 47. Y'all got your ears on back there? Nothing but static answered me, that peculiar empty sound that seemed to swallow my words before they could travel more than a few feet from my antenna. I tried again, switching channels, but every frequency carried the same hollow silence, punctuated by brief bursts of what almost sounded like whispers in a language I didn't recognize. The convoy behind me had grown to 7 trucks now, all maintaining that same impossible precision in their following distance and formation. Through the rain-streaked mirrors I could see they were all the same model, what looked like late-model Peterbilts with identical sleeper configurations and running light patterns. Their headlights never wavered, never adjusted for curves or hills, just maintained that steady hypnotic glow that seemed to pierce through the storm with unnatural clarity. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, but I decided to take the next exit anyway, hoping to break away from whatever strange procession had formed behind me. The Coalinga Junction was only a few miles ahead, a truck stop I'd used countless times before, and the familiar thought of coffee and fluorescent lights felt like a lifeline in the growing unease that had settled in my chest like a cold weight. But as I signaled for the exit, something impossible happened. The trucks behind me began to fade, not pulling away or changing lanes, but actually becoming translucent, their headlights dimming like dying stars, while their chrome and paint seemed to dissolve into the rain itself. I blinked hard, certain that fatigue was playing tricks with my vision, but when I looked again, they were gone completely, leaving nothing but empty highway stretching behind me into the darkness. The truck stop appeared ahead, its neon signs casting pink and blue reflections on the wet pavement. But as I downshifted and began to brake, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The other trucks weren't behind me anymore. They were already here, parked in perfect formation along the back edge of the lot, their engines silent, but their running lights still glowing in the rain. 7 identical Peterbilts arranged like soldiers at attention, their sleeper windows dark and somehow watchful. I pulled into a parking space as far from them as possible, near the diner entrance, where other trucks sat scattered in more natural, haphazard positions. Real trucks driven by real people, who were probably inside drinking coffee and complaining about the weather. But as I shut down my engine, and the familiar diesel rumble died away, I noticed that none of those other trucks had their lights on. In fact, they looked abandoned, covered with a layer of dust and grime that spoke of weeks or months of sitting unused. The rain continued to fall, harder now, turning the parking lot into a shallow lake that reflected the truck stop's neon signs and fractured patterns of color. I sat in my cab for several minutes, watching the 7 mysterious trucks through my rain-streaked windshield, waiting for some sign of movement or life from their darkened cab. But they remained perfectly still, like monuments to some unknown purpose, their chrome surfaces streaming with water that seemed to run upward rather than down. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, the rain soaked through my jacket immediately, cold droplets that seemed to carry an electric charge that made my skin crawl. The diner's entrance was only 30 yards away, but walking across that flooded parking lot felt like crossing an ocean, each step sending ripples across the water that reflected the running lights of the 7 trucks in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The diner was empty except for a single waitress who looked up from her magazine, with eyes that didn't quite focus on my face. She was middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, and when she spoke, her voice had a hollow quality that seemed to echo from somewhere much farther away than her position behind the counter. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for a cup without waiting for my answer. The coffee was black and bitter, with a metallic taste that coated my tongue unpleasantly, but it was hot, and I wrapped my hands around the ceramic mug gratefully, trying to drive away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. "Strange weather for this time of year," I said, more to hear a human voice than because I expected conversation, but the waitress just nodded absently and returned to her magazine, its pages rustling with each turn like dry leaves in an autumn wind. Through the diner's rain-streaked windows, I could see the 7 trucks clearly now, and what I observed made my coffee cup tremble in my hand. There were drivers in those cabs after all, silhouetted figures sitting motionless behind their steering wheels, but their postures were wrong somehow, too rigid and still to be natural. As I watched, one of the figures turned its head toward the diner window, and though I couldn't make out any features through the rain and distance, I felt the weight of its attention like a physical pressure against my chest. The lights in the diner flickered once, twice, then steadied, and in that brief moment of darkness, I could have sworn I heard the sound of diesel engines starting up outside, a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. But when the lights came back up, the 7 trucks remained silent and still, their engines dark and their exhaust stacks cold. I finished my coffee quickly and left money on the counter, nodding to the waitress who didn't look up from her magazine. The rain had lessened slightly, but walking back to my truck still felt like moving through liquid darkness, each step heavy with the sensation of being watched by those motionless figures in their identical cabs. My Kenworth started on the first turn of the key, its familiar engine note a comfort in the strangeness of that night, and I pulled out of the parking lot as quickly as I dared on the wet pavement. But as I accelerated back onto Highway 99, checking my mirrors for any sign of pursuit, I realized that the 7 trucks were gone again, their parking spaces empty except for pools of standing water that reflected nothing but the storm clouds overhead. The rain stopped abruptly as I crossed the San Joaquin River Bridge, as if someone had turned off a celestial faucet, and stars began to appear through breaks in the dispersing cloud. My CB radio crackled back to life, filling with the familiar voices of other drivers reporting their positions and weather conditions, normal conversations that felt like a return to sanity after the surreal events at the truck stop. But as I settled into the rhythm of night driving once more, letting the miles roll by beneath my wheels, I began to notice something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. Every few minutes when I glanced in my mirrors during routine safety checks, I caught glimpses of headlights, the handprint under the window.
From Jake Morrison.
The thing about driving nights is you start seeing patterns where there shouldn't be any. After 15 years hauling freight across the Continental Divide, I thought I'd cataloged every shadow, every trick of headlights on fog, every way the darkness could play games with a tired mind. But somewhere outside Barstow, with my 18-wheeler loaded down with appliances bound for Phoenix, I discovered there were still lessons the road had left to teach me. It was one of those desert nights where the air sits heavy despite the cold, thick with the kind of silence that makes you check your radio just to be sure it's still working. The CB crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers, complaints about DOT way stations and recommendations for all-night diners, but even their voices seemed muted, swallowed up by the vast emptiness stretching out beyond my headlight beams. My Peterbilt's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby, a steady rhythm that had carried me through countless nights just like this one. The fuel gauge was kissing the quarter tank mark when I spotted the truck stop's neon sign bleeding red and blue into the darkness ahead. Mickey's Desert Oasis, the sign read, though half the letters flickered like they were fighting a losing battle against the night. It wasn't one of the big chain stops, just a mom-and-pop operation with a handful of pumps, a small diner and a parking area that had seen better decades. But fuel was fuel, and I needed enough diesel to make it to my morning delivery in Tempe. I pulled into the lot, the weight of my trailer making the Peterbilt's air brakes hiss as I brought her to a stop beside the pumps. The place was quiet, too quiet for a truck stop on a major freight route. Usually these desert stops buzzed with activity all night long, drivers grabbing coffee and catching a few hours of mandated rest. But Mickey's felt abandoned. The only other vehicle I could see was an old sedan parked in the shadows near the diner, its windows dark and covered with a fine layer of dust that suggested it had been sitting there for more than just a few hours. The fuel pump wheezed and clicked as I filled my tanks, the numbers spinning on the display like a slot machine nobody ever wins. While the diesel flowed, I walked around my rig for the routine inspection I performed at every stop. Tires looked good, trailer doors were secure, lights were functioning. Everything appeared normal until I reached the passenger side of my cab, where the fuel island's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows against the truck's aluminum skin. Just below the passenger window, pressed flat against the door like someone had placed their hand there and pushed hard, was a handprint. Not just any handprint, but one that seemed wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. The fingers were too long, stretched out like they'd been pulled through warm taffy. The palm was narrow and the thumb curved at an angle that would have been impossible for a human hand to achieve. But what made my skin crawl was the way it seemed to have been burned into the metal itself, leaving a mark that was somehow both darker and lighter than the surrounding surface. I bent down to examine it more closely, running my own hand over the spot. The metal was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been given the desert's lingering heat, and my fingers came away with a faint residue that smelled like copper pennies and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. The handprint was definitely there, pressed into the door like a permanent shadow, but I couldn't remember seeing it during my pre-trip inspection in Los Angeles. I was meticulous about checking my equipment, had to be in this business, and something that obvious wouldn't have escaped my notice. The fuel pump clicked off behind me, breaking the spell of concentration I'd fallen into while studying the strange mark. I capped the tanks and went inside to pay, hoping the clerk might have some explanation for what I'd found. The diner was one of those time capsule places that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. All orange vinyl booth seats and wood grain Formica countertops. A single waitress, a woman in her 60s with hair dyed an improbable shade of red, stood behind the register reading a paperback romance novel. "Saw you out there looking at your truck," she said without glancing up from her book. "Found something interesting, did you?" "Just a handprint on the door," I said, pulling out my wallet. "Probably just some kid messing around at my last stop. $47.50 for the diesel." She looked up then, and I noticed her eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost colorless. "Handprint, you said?" What it looked like, I described the mark, the strange proportions and the way it seemed burned into the metal. As I talked, her expression grew more serious, the casual friendliness draining from her face like water from a cracked basin. She asked, "First time through this way," I admitted. "Usually stick to the northern corridors, but dispatch needed someone to cover this run." She nodded slowly, as if that explained something. "We get drivers through here sometimes. Find marks like that on their rig. Never the same truck twice, mind you, and never the drivers who come through regular. Always the ones who are just passing through, taking an unfamiliar route. What causes it?" She rang up my fuel purchase, her fingers moving mechanically over the register keys. "Some folks say it's just oxidation, road chemicals playing tricks on the metal. Others think it's something else entirely. What do you think?" She handed me my receipt, and for just a moment our fingers touched. Her skin was as cold as the handprint had been. I think there are things in the desert that don't much care for strangers. In the harsh glare of the fuel island lights, it looked even more pronounced, the impossible angles of the fingers casting their own tiny shadows. I tried rubbing it with a rag from my toolbox, then with some degreaser I kept for cleaning stubborn road grime, but nothing affected it. The mark remained as clear and unsettling as before. I was so focused on the handprint that I almost missed the movement in my peripheral vision. When I looked up, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the fluorescent lights. It was tall and thin, too thin, with arms that hung down longer than they should have. In the darkness, I couldn't make out any details of its face or clothing, just a vaguely human silhouette that seemed to sway slightly, as if moved by a breeze I couldn't feel. "Hey," I called out, thinking it might be another driver who needed help with something. "You okay over there?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move except for that subtle swaying motion. I took a step toward it, and that's when I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. One of its arms was raised, the hand pressed against an invisible surface at exactly the same height as the passenger window of my cab. The fingers were spread wide, and even from a distance I could see they were too long, stretched out in the same impossible configuration as the handprint on my door. The beam cut through the darkness, but when the light reached the spot where the figure had been standing, there was nothing there, just empty asphalt and the desert beyond, stretching out into the night like a black ocean. My hands were shaking as I climbed back into my cab, and I noticed the temperature inside the truck had dropped noticeably. My breath came out in small puffs of vapor, even though the desert air outside was still warm. I started the engine, and pulled out of Mickey's desert oasis, as quickly as I safely could, glancing repeatedly in my mirrors to make sure nothing was following me. Over the steady rumble of the diesel engine, and the whisper of tires on asphalt, I could hear something else, a rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against metal, coming from somewhere on the passenger side of the cab. The sound was faint but persistent, matching the rhythm of my heartbeat with uncanny precision. I pulled over at the next rest area, a well-lit state facility with picnic tables and vending machines, and walked around to inspect the passenger side again. The handprint was still there, but now it seemed somehow deeper, more defined, and the metal around it had taken on a pattern of smaller marks, as if something had been gripping the door handle and clawing at the smooth surface beneath the window. The taste of memory. From Marcus Wheeler. After 23 years of hauling freight across this country's veins of asphalt and concrete, I thought I'd experienced every kind of weather Mother Nature could conjure. But this fog was different, settling on my tongue the moment I cracked the window of my Peterbilt 37-9, tasting unmistakably of wood smoke and something else I couldn't quite place, something that made my chest tighten with an inexplicable sense of loss. The CB radio had been chattering about the sudden weather change for the past hour, drivers warning each other about the wall of white that seemed to appear from nowhere across the Nebraska plains. One trucker mentioned seeing it rise from the ground like steam from freshly turned earth. Another swore it was moving against the wind. I'd laughed it off then, focusing on making good time with my load of electronics bound for Denver. But now, enveloped in the thick blanket of mist, their words echoed in my mind with uncomfortable weight. My headlights penetrated maybe 15 feet into the gray-white mass, creating a tunnel of visibility so narrow it felt like driving through a cave. The familiar hum of my diesel engine seemed muffled, wrapped in cotton, and even the steady rhythm of my tires on asphalt sounded distant and hollow. I'd slowed to 30 miles per hour, hazards blinking, following the reflective markers on the shoulder like breadcrumbs through a fairy tale forest that had forgotten its ending. The taste grew stronger as I drove deeper into the fog bank, and with it came a sensation I hadn't felt in decades, a pulling in my chest like homesickness. Wood smoke, yes, but underneath it something sweeter, something that reminded me of autumn evenings in my grandmother's kitchen when I was 7 years old. Apple wood, I realized with a start that made me nearly swerve into the guardrail. She used to burn apple wood in her old cast iron stove, and the smoke would curl from her chimney and settle over the entire farm like a blessing. But that farmhouse had burned down 40 years ago, taking my grandmother with it, and I hadn't thought about apple wood smoke in longer than I cared to remember. The memory hit me with such sudden clarity that I could almost see her weathered hands, kneading bread dough, could almost hear her humming that old hymn she loved while the fire crackled, and the smoke carried the scent of burning fruit trees through the kitchen window. I shook my head trying to focus on the road, but the fog seemed to be getting thicker rather than thinner, and now I was catching glimpses of shapes in my peripheral vision, dark forms that vanished the moment I turned to look directly at them. My speedometer had dropped to 25 without my conscious decision, and I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The CB crackled to life, startling me from my increasingly uneasy thoughts. Any drivers still in that fog bank on I-80 eastbound? The voice was unfamiliar, scratchy with static. Anyone else tasting that smoke? I reached for the handset, grateful for human contact. This is Wheeler in the Blue Pete, about mile marker 95. Copy on the smoke taste. Good, buddy. What's your 20? Static answered me, then a voice I didn't recognize, though something about the cadence seemed familiar. Wheeler, is that little Marcus Wheeler from the farm on County Road? My blood went cold. Nobody had called me Little Marcus in 4 decades. Not since I'd left Nebraska at 18 and never looked back. And County Road 12, that was where my grandmother's farm had been, where I'd spent those summers before the fire changed everything. Negative, driver. You've got me confused with someone else. My voice came out steadier than I felt. What's your handle? Of course it's you, Marcus. I'd recognize that voice anywhere, even after all these years. This is your old friend Tommy Brennan. Remember me? Used to help your grandma stack wood for winter? I nearly dropped the handset. Tommy Brennan had been my grandmother's neighbor, an old man even when I was young, and he died in the same fire that took her. I'd been at the funeral, had watched them lower his simple pine coffin into the ground beside hers in the little cemetery behind the Methodist church. This isn't funny, whoever you are. I keyed the mic with a trembling finger. Tommy Brennan's been dead 40 years. The voice carried a note of confusion, wrapped in static that was growing worse by the moment. Marcus, boy, what are you talking about? I just came from your grandma's place. She's got a fresh apple pie cooling on the windowsill, and that wood stove's burning something fierce. Says you should come home for supper. The fog around me began to change, and I realized with growing horror that I could see lights flickering through the white shroud, warm yellow rectangles that looked impossibly like windows. Farmhouse windows, glowing with the soft light of kerosene lamps and wood fires. The smoke taste on my tongue intensified until I could barely breathe, and somewhere in the distance I swear I could hear the creak of a porch swing, and the faint melody of that old hymn my grandmother used to hum. My truck was slowing on its own now, the engine responding to some force I couldn't understand, and through the windshield I saw a sight that made my rational mind rebel even as my heart leaped with impossible hope. There, emerging from the fog like a memory made manifest, stood my grandmother's farmhouse, whole and untouched by flame, smoke rising from its chimney in a straight column toward the hidden stars. Every detail was exactly as I remembered from childhood. The wraparound porch with its white railings, the red door that needed painting, the apple trees in the front yard heavy with fruit that glowed like lanterns in the mist. Even the old tire swing hung from the oak tree, turning slowly in a breeze I couldn't feel. I brought the truck to a stop without conscious thought, the air brakes hissing like serpents in the strange silence that had fallen over the world. The CB radio crackled once more, and Tommy Brennan's impossible voice drifted through the static. She's waiting for you, Marcus. Been waiting all these years. Says, supper's getting cold. The farmhouse door opened, and a figure stepped onto the porch, small and bent with age, wearing the blue dress with tiny flowers that I remembered so well. She raised her hand in greeting, and even through the fog and impossible distance, I could see her smile, the same gentle expression that had comforted me through countless childhood scraped knees and hurt feelings. I found myself reaching for the door handle, my body moving without permission from my mind, drawn by a longing so intense it felt like physical pain. Home, my heart whispered. After 40 years of running, of hauling freight across endless highways and sleeping in truck stop parking lots, I could finally go home. But as my fingers touched the cold metal of the handle, some deeper survival instinct kicked in, the part of me that had learned to navigate the darkness of 4 decades on the road. This wasn't real, couldn't be real, and whatever force was creating this vision of comfort and warmth, it didn't belong in the world of the living. The truck lurched forward reluctantly, as if it too was being pulled toward the impossible farmhouse, and I heard a sound that nearly broke my resolve, my grandmother's voice, calling my name across the years and the fog. "Marcus, sweetheart, don't leave me again. Stay for supper. Stay forever." Tears I didn't know I was crying blurred my vision as I pressed harder on the accelerator, fighting against the supernatural current that wanted to drag me into whatever realm existed beyond that fog. The farmhouse lights grew brighter, more insistent, and I could smell not just wood smoke now, but the actual scent of my grandmother's apple pie, the cinnamon and nutmeg, and love that had made everything better when the world seemed too large and frightening for a 7-year-old boy. The speedometer climbed past 30, then 40, and slowly, painfully, the lights began to fade behind me. The fog started to thin at the edges, revealing glimpses of ordinary interstate, of reflector posts and guardrails, and the blessed mundane reality of modern asphalt. The smoke taste on my tongue gradually gave way to the familiar diesel fumes and truck stop coffee that had been the flavor of my adult life. When I finally broke free of the fog bank, emerging into a clear Nebraska night, studded with stars, I pulled onto the shoulder and sat shaking in my driver's seat for 20 minutes, before I trusted myself to continue. The CB radio remained silent. The Silent Fleet. From Marcus Chen. I've been driving the interstate highways for over 15 years now, hauling everything from electronics to produce across this vast country. And in all that time, I thought I'd seen every kind of strange thing the road could offer. Late-night UFO sightings over Nebraska wheat fields, phantom hitchhikers who vanish from your passenger seat, those mysterious truck stops that seem to exist only when you desperately need them and disappear by morning. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I discovered in the town of Millbrook Falls on that foggy October night 3 months ago. I was running behind schedule, carrying a load of automotive parts from Detroit to Phoenix, when my rig started making that telltale grinding sound that every trucker learns to fear. The transmission was acting up again, slipping gears and shuddering like an old dog trying to climb stairs. I'd been nursing it along for the past 100 miles, but as I crested the hill overlooking Millbrook Falls, I knew I wasn't going to make it much further without some serious mechanical attention. The town spread out below me in the valley, a modest collection of buildings, wrapped in tendrils of mist that seemed to rise from the river running through its center. What struck me immediately was how many trucks were scattered throughout the streets, far more than you'd expect in a town this size. They were parked everywhere, massive 18-wheelers lining the main drag, smaller delivery trucks tucked into side streets, and what looked like an entire fleet of identical white semi-trucks, arranged in perfect rows behind what I assumed was some kind of depot or maintenance facility. I guided my struggling rig down the winding road into town, the transmission protesting with every gear change. The fog grew thicker as I descended, wrapping around my cab like cotton batting, and reducing visibility to just a few dozen yards. The streetlights created ghostly halos in the mist, and I had to lean forward over my steering wheel to make out the road ahead. As I rolled slowly down Main Street, looking for any sign of a truck stop or repair shop, I began to notice something odd about all those parked vehicles. Despite the late hour, which was just past 11 p.m., there were no drivers visible anywhere, no figures moving between the trucks, no lights glowing in the sleeper cabs, no one standing around smoking cigarettes or stretching their legs. The trucks just sat there in the fog, like enormous sleeping beasts, their chrome bumpers and mirrors gleaming wetly under the street lamps. I found what appeared to be a combination truck stop and diner called Mabel's Rest, its neon sign flickering intermittently through the mist, with several letters dark. The parking lot was spacious enough for my rig, though I had to maneuver carefully around several other trucks that were parked at odd angles, as if their drivers had simply stopped wherever they happened to be and walked away. When I shut off my engine, the sudden silence was profound. Usually, even in the quietest truck stops, you can hear the rumble of idling diesels, the hiss of air brakes, the subtle mechanical sounds that dozens of large vehicles make, even when they're resting. But here there was nothing. Just the soft patter of condensing fog dripping from the overhead canopy and the distant sound of the river moving through the valley. The diner was open, warm yellow light spilling from its windows onto the wet pavement, and I could see a few customers sitting at the counter inside. As I walked toward the entrance, I passed close to several of the parked trucks and noticed that their engines were still warm. I could feel the heat radiating from the hoods, and when I placed my hand on one of the chrome exhaust stacks, it was almost too hot to touch. These vehicles had been running recently, perhaps within the last hour or two. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was as strange as the parking lot outside. 3 people sat at the counter, a middle-aged woman in a waitress uniform, an older man in coveralls who looked like a mechanic, and a younger guy wearing a flannel shirt and baseball cap. They were all perfectly still, staring straight ahead at their coffee cups, not talking, not moving, barely seeming to breathe. When I entered, the little bell above the door chimed, but none of them turned to look at me. The waitress behind the counter was a tired-looking woman with graying hair pulled back in a loose bun. She smiled when she saw me, but it was a strange smile, too wide and held for too long. "Welcome to Mabel's, hon," she said in a voice that seemed to echo slightly in the quiet space. "Coffee?" "Yeah." I nodded and took a seat at the far end of the counter, several stools away from the motionless customers. "Thanks. Listen, my transmission is acting up pretty badly. Is there a repair shop in town that might be open? Or at least somewhere I can park overnight and get some help in the morning?" She poured coffee into a white ceramic mug, the liquid steaming in the cool air. "Oh, you don't need to worry about that, hon. Your truck will be just fine. They always are, once folks decide to stay a while in Millbrook Falls." Her smile never wavered as she spoke, and I noticed that she didn't seem to blink as often as normal people do. I asked, but she had already turned away to wipe down the coffee machine, humming softly to herself in tune I didn't recognize. The 3 customers at the counter remained completely motionless, and now that I was closer, I could see that their eyes were open, but unfocused, staring at something far beyond the diner's wall. The coffee in their cups had developed a thin skin on top, suggesting it had been sitting there untouched for quite some time. Through the window I could see more trucks arriving in the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the fog as they navigated between the already parked vehicles. But here's what made my skin crawl. Once each truck found a parking spot and its lights went dark, I never saw anyone get out. The drivers simply vanished, leaving their rigs sitting silent and empty like all the others. I left money for the coffee and walked back outside, my unease growing with each step. The fog had grown thicker, and the number of trucks in the lot seemed to have doubled. They were everywhere now, arranged in neat rows that extended far beyond what should have been possible, given the size of the property. It was as if the parking lot itself had expanded to accommodate them all. The grinding sound in the transmission was gone. When I turned the key, the engine started immediately and purred like it was fresh from the factory. All the gauges read normal, and when I tested the gears, the transmission shifted smoothly through its full range. Whatever had been wrong with it was completely fixed. I should have been relieved, but instead I felt a deep chill run through me. I wanted nothing more than to leave this place immediately, but as I tried to navigate back toward the street, I discovered that the parked trucks seemed to have shifted position, creating a maze-like arrangement that blocked every exit. No matter which way I turned, I found myself facing another wall of silent semis. It was the sound of engines starting up all around me, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, but there was something wrong with the sound. Diesel engines have a distinctive rumble, a deep bass note that you feel in your chest as much as hear with your ear. But these engines sounded muffled and distant, as if they were running underwater or in some other dimension parallel to our own. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperately seeking a way out of the truck maze, but the paths between vehicles seemed to shift and change whenever I wasn't looking directly at them. Trucks that I swear had been on my left would somehow appear on my right, and passages that looked clear ahead would suddenly be blocked by the massive bulk of a trailer. They emerged from the fog like phantoms, walking slowly between the trucks with that same unfocused stare I had seen on the customers in the diner. They moved with mechanical precision, their footsteps making no sound on the wet pavement, and when they reached their respective vehicles, they simply climbed into the cabs and sat motionless behind the steering wheel. One of them approached my truck, a man in his 50s, wearing a standard trucker's cap and jacket. His face was pale and expressionless, and his eyes reflected the fog-filtered streetlight like mirror. He reached up toward my passenger door, and I heard the handle rattle as he tried to open it. When that didn't work, he simply stood there beside my cab, staring up at me through the side window with that terrible empty gaze. The frequency of joy. From Marcus Chen. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of 3 hours. As I guided my Peterbilt down Interstate 80, through the Nevada desert, the digital clock on my dashboard glowed a steady 11:47, and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretched ahead into darkness, broken only by my headlights and the occasional sweep of distant stars. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Sacramento to Denver for the past 6 years, and this route had become as familiar as the lines on my weathered hands. The hum of the diesel engine beneath me provided its usual steady comfort, a mechanical lullaby that had seen me through countless lonely nights on the road. I reached over and adjusted the CB's squelch, hoping to catch some chatter from other drivers. The isolation of night driving could weigh heavy on a man's mind, and sometimes a friendly voice sharing road conditions, or just passing the time, could make all the difference between staying alert and letting the hypnotic rhythm of the highway lull you into dangerous drowsiness. The radio hissed and popped, cycling through empty channels until I finally caught something on channel 19. Laughter. High-pitched, musical, almost like children giggling at a private joke. The sound danced through the static, weaving in and out of the white noise like silver thread through black cloth. I frowned and adjusted the tuning, thinking perhaps I'd caught some bleed over from a distant AM station. But the laughter remained clear and distinct, floating through my cab with an odd ethereal quality that made the hair on my arms stand at attention. The Nevada landscape rolling past my windows seemed to respond to the sound, the scrub brush and distant mountains taking on strange, fluid shapes in my peripheral vision. I shook my head, attributing the visual distortions to fatigue and eye strain. I'd been driving for 9 hours straight, stopping only for fuel and a quick sandwich at a truck stop outside Reno. Perhaps it was time to find a safe place to pull over and catch a few hours of rest. There was something hypnotic about it, something that made me want to keep listening even as an uncomfortable chill began to creep up my spine. The giggles seemed to form patterns, rising and falling in waves that almost resembled conversation, as if multiple voices were taking turns sharing some cosmic joke that existed just beyond my understanding. I found myself leaning forward, straining to make sense of the sounds, to catch some hint of words hidden within the musical cascades of mirth. The CB's LED display showed I was still tuned to channel 19, but when I tried to key the microphone and break in with a standard greeting, my voice seemed to disappear into the void. The laughter continued uninterrupted, as if I existed in some parallel frequency where I could hear but could not be heard. The sensation was deeply unsettling, like being trapped behind one-way glass, while invisible observers found endless amusement in my growing confusion. Miles passed beneath my wheels as the laughter evolved and changed. Sometimes it would fade to barely a whisper, forcing me to turn up the volume, only to suddenly surge back with renewed intensity that made me jump in my seat. Other times the giggles would layer upon themselves, creating harmonies that seemed to echo from impossible spaces within the small confines of my cab. The sound began to feel three-dimensional, as if the sources of laughter were moving around me, circling my truck like playful spirits riding the desert wind. I tried switching to other channels, but channel 19 seemed to be the only frequency receiving any signal at all. Every other channel offered nothing but dead silence. Not even the usual background static that typically filled the airwaves. It was as if the entire CB spectrum had been cleared except for this one bizarre transmission that continued to fill my cab with its infectious, unsettling joy. The isolation felt complete and absolute, cutting me off from the community of drivers that usually provided comfort and companionship during these solitary journeys. What felt like minutes would turn out to be hours according to my dashboard clock, and stretches that seemed to last forever would pass in mere moments. I found myself losing track of mile markers and exit signs, the familiar landmarks of my regular route seeming to shift and blur together in ways that made no logical sense. The usual rhythm of the road, the predictable patterns of hills and curves that I knew by heart, seemed to have been replaced by something fluid and dreamlike. What had started as innocent, childlike giggling slowly took on deeper undertones, as if the voices were maturing even as I listened. The pitch would occasionally drop to adult registers before climbing back to those silvery, youthful heights. Sometimes I could swear I heard my own voice mixed into the chorus, my own laughter echoing back at me from some impossible source within the radio's speaker. Shadows moved independently of their sources, flowing across the landscape like dark water. The stars overhead seemed to pulse in rhythm with the laughter, and the moon, hanging low on the horizon, appeared to be wearing a smile that grew wider with each passing mile. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, checked my logbook to confirm I hadn't been driving beyond legal limits, but everything appeared normal except for this growing sense that reality itself had become negotiable. At first they appeared to be another truck, approaching from behind in my mirrors. Red and amber lights that moved with the familiar pattern of a big rig making good time down the interstate. But as the lights grew closer, they began to behave in ways that trucking equipment simply could. They would separate and dance around each other, merge back together, then split off in different directions before reforming in new configuration. The laughter from my CB grew more intense, more musical, as if the approaching lights were conducting some invisible orchestra of mirth. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but my speedometer seemed frozen despite the increasing roar of my engine. The mysterious lights continued to gain ground, and I realized they weren't following the road at all, but were instead traveling directly across the desert, floating several feet above the scrub brush and sand. They moved with purpose and intelligence, converging on my position from multiple angles, like hunters closing in on prey. The laughter reached a crescendo that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Through the cacophony of supernatural joy, I began to hear something else. Something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Words. Faint and distorted, but unmistakably words hidden within the endless stream of giggles and chuckle. They were calling my name, Marcus, over and over again, as if inviting me to join their celebration, to become part of whatever cosmic joke they found so endlessly entertaining. The lights surrounded my truck now, pacing me on all sides like an honor guard made of pure luminescence. In their glow I could see shapes moving within them, vague silhouettes that might have been human if humans could exist as beings of pure light and laughter. They pressed closer to my windows, and I could feel their presence like warm breath against the glass. The CB radio's laughter had become so loud it seemed to originate from inside my own skull, and I realized with growing horror that I was beginning to laugh along with them, unable to stop myself from joining their eternal chorus of joy. With tremendous effort I reached for the CB's power switch and yanked it off, The sudden silence was like diving into deep, cold water after being trapped in a furnace. The lights faltered, dimmed, and began to fall behind as if the radio had been some kind of beacon that they needed to maintain their pursuit. My speedometer returned to normal readings. The desert resumed its familiar empty appearance, and the oppressive sensation of being watched began to fade. I pulled into the next truck stop I could find, hands shaking as I parked and killed the engine. The CB radio sat silent on its mount, looking perfectly innocent in the harsh glare of the parking lot's security light. I considered leaving it off permanently, but I knew that would be impossible. A trucker without a CB is like a sailor without a compass, cut off from vital information about road conditions, weather, and emergencies. The CB remained silent for the rest of the trip, picking up only normal traffic on all channels. I convinced myself that I'd experienced nothing more than fatigue-induced hallucinations, perhaps combined with some unusual atmospheric conditions that had created the strange light phenomenon. But deep down I knew better. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone on a dark stretch of highway, I catch glimpses of distant lights moving in impossible ways across the desert, and sometimes, if I listen very carefully to the static between stations, I can still hear it. The luminous path. From Marcus, the first time I noticed the glowing mile marker, I thought it was just a trick of my headlights catching some new reflective paint. Highway 287 cuts through some of the loneliest stretches of Montana, where the darkness between towns can swallow you whole, and the only company you have is the steady thrum of your diesel engine, and whatever late-night radio station hasn't faded into static. I'd been driving this route for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from farm equipment to furniture across the northern plains, and I knew every curve, every pothole, every rusted sign that marked my progress through the endless night. But mile marker 2047 had never glowed like that before. It was past 2 in the morning when I first saw it, that soft blue-white luminescence hovering just above the painted numbers on the green highway sign. The rest of the marker looked normal enough in my headlight beams. Standard federal highway issue with its reflective backing and sturdy metal post. But those numbers seemed to pulse with their own internal light. I slowed my rig down from 70 to 60, then to 50, craning my neck to get a better look as I passed. The glow didn't fade as my headlights swept past it. If anything, it seemed to brighten in the darkness behind me, visible in my side mirror until the road curved and took it from view. I told myself it was fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. I'd been on the road for 11 hours straight, pushing to make a delivery deadline in Billings, and the monotony of night driving could make a man see all sorts of things that weren't there. The brain has a way of creating patterns and meaning where none exist, especially when you're running on truck stop coffee and determination. But the image of that softly glowing marker stayed with me for the rest of the drive, nagging at the back of my mind like a half-remembered song. 3 weeks later, I found myself on the same stretch of highway, hauling a load of construction materials back toward Missoula. The night was clearer this time, with a half-moon casting silver light across the rolling prairie, and I was more alert, having started the journey well-rested and caffeinated. As I approached the area where I'd seen the strange marker, I found myself unconsciously slowing down, my eyes scanning the roadside for that familiar green rectangle. There it was again, mile marker 2047, glowing with that same ethereal blue-white light. But this time, I was certain it wasn't a reflection or an optical illusion. The luminescence seemed to emanate from within the numbers themselves, as if they'd been painted with some kind of phosphorescent material. I pulled my rig over to the shoulder, hazard lights blinking, and grabbed my flashlight from the door pocket. The familiar sounds of my idling diesel engine faded behind me, replaced by the soft whisper of wind through the sparse roadside grass. As I got closer, the glow seemed to intensify, and I could see that it wasn't just the numbers that were luminous. Thin veins of light traced through the metal of the sign itself, creating delicate patterns that reminded me of lightning, or the branching of tree roots. I reached out to touch the sign, and immediately pulled my hand back. The metal was warm, radiating heat like a piece of machinery that had been running for hours. There was also a subtle vibration, a barely perceptible humming that seemed to travel up through the ground and into my bones. I clicked on my flashlight and played the beam across the marker, but the artificial light only seemed to make the glow more pronounced, not less. The driver gave a polite toot of his horn, probably wondering if I needed assistance, but didn't stop. I realized how I must have looked, standing alone on the roadside in the middle of the night, staring at a highway sign. I hurried back to my cab, but not before taking one more look at the marker. The patterns of light within the metal seemed to have shifted, forming new configurations that my eyes couldn't quite follow. The next few runs along Highway 287 became exercises in anticipation and dread. Mile marker 2047 was always glowing when I passed it, day or night, though the luminescence was more visible in darkness. I began to notice other details too. The grass around the base of the signpost had grown thicker and more vibrant than the surrounding prairie vegetation, forming a perfect circle of deep green that extended about 10 feet from the marker in all directions. Sometimes I glimpsed small animals in that circle, rabbits and field mice that seemed unusually active and unafraid of the highway traffic. I started paying attention to the truckers I'd encounter on that stretch of road, recognizing the regulars who ran similar routes. There was Jim Hadley in his bright red Peterbilt, Sarah Chen with her immaculate Kenworth, and old Pete Kowalski, who'd been driving these highways since before I was born. We'd exchange friendly waves and the occasional conversation over the CB radio, part of the informal brotherhood that develops among drivers who share the same lonely stretches of asphalt. One by one, they stopped appearing on Highway 2. Jim first, then Sarah, then Pete. When I asked about them at truck stops and way stations, I got vague responses. Some had heard they'd switched routes, others thought they might have taken time off or moved to different companies. But truckers are creatures of habit and routine, and it struck me as odd that so many familiar faces would disappear from a route they'd been running for years. The weather had turned ugly about 50 miles outside of Great Falls, with thick fog rolling in from the north and reducing visibility to maybe 30 feet. I'd slowed my rig down to a crawl, hazard lights blinking, following the white line on the right edge of the road more by feel than sight. The radio crackled with warnings from other drivers about the conditions, and I was seriously considering pulling over to wait for the fog to lift when I saw the glow up ahead. Mile marker 247 cut through the fog like a lighthouse beacon, its blue-white luminescence creating a sphere of clear air around the sign. As I approached, I could see the road clearly for the first time in an hour, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But that relief quickly turned to confusion, then to growing horror, as I realized what else I could see in that circle of clear air. There were trucks parked in the ditch beside the road, their shapes barely visible in the ethereal light emanating from the marker. Not abandoned trucks, not wrecks, but perfectly intact rigs that looked like they'd simply pulled over and stopped. I recognized Jim Hadley's red Peterbilt first, then Sarah's Kenworth parked behind it. Pete's old blue Freightliner was there too, along with at least a dozen other trucks I didn't recognize, all arranged in a rough semicircle around the glowing sign. I brought my rig to a complete stop on the highway, engine idling, and stared at the scene before me. The trucks looked undamaged, their chrome bumpers and running lights gleaming in the strange radiance. But there was something profoundly wrong with the way they sat, tilted at odd angles, as if they'd sunk partially into the earth. And the silence was absolute. No engine noise, no running lights, no movement in any of the cabs. But the figures I glimpsed moving between the vehicles weren't quite right. They were too tall, too fluid in their movements, and they seemed to glide rather than walk across the uneven ground. When one of them passed directly through the beam of light from the marker, I could see that it cast no shadow. The fog began to shift and swirl around my truck, and I realized with growing alarm that whatever force was emanating from the mile marker was starting to affect me as well. My diesel engine, which had been running smoothly moments before, began to sputter and miss. The electrical systems flickered, causing my headlights to dim and my radio to emit bursts of static. Most disturbing of all, I could feel my truck being drawn forward, as if some invisible cable had been attached to my front bumper, and was slowly but inexorably pulling me toward the collection of silent vehicles. I fought against the sensation, pressing harder on the brake pedal and downshifting to engage my engine brake, but my rig continued its slow slide toward the ditch. The steering wheel felt loose in my hands, unresponsive to my attempts to turn away from the mark. Through my windshield I could see more of those tall, gliding figures emerging from between the parked trucks, moving toward me with purposeful intent. The cold that burns. From Jake Morrison, the first thing you learn about diesel fuel is that it doesn't like the cold. It gels up around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, turns thick as honey, and can leave you stranded on some godforsaken stretch of highway with nothing but your CB radio and a prayer. That's why I always kept additives in my cab, why I checked the weather reports religiously, why I planned my routes to avoid the worst of winter's bite. 23 years hauling freight across the northern states had taught me to respect the cold, to understand its ways, to work with it rather than against it. But what I discovered that December night on Route 2 through northern Maine challenged everything I thought I knew about the laws of physics, about diesel, about the very nature of cold itself. I was running a load of auto parts from Detroit to Bangor, my trusty Kenworth T680 humming steady through the darkness. The engine was a Cummins ISX-15, reliable as sunrise, and she'd never let me down in all the miles we'd covered together. The heater was working overtime against the bitter wind that swept down from the Canadian border, carrying with it the promise of snow and the kind of cold that makes your bones ache just thinking about it. The radio weatherman had been talking about record lows, temperatures that hadn't been seen in decades, a polar vortex that was pushing Arctic air further south than it had any business being. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, plenty to make it to my scheduled fuel stop in Calais, but as the miles rolled beneath my wheels and the temperature gauge on my dashboard continued its steady descent, I began to notice something peculiar. The engine temperature was running cooler than usual, not dangerously so, but enough to make me glance at the gauges more frequently than normal. The outside temperature display showed -18 degrees and falling, well into the range where diesel should start causing problems, yet my engine was running smooth as silk. It appeared in my mirrors like a ghost materializing from the darkness, running without lights on the empty highway behind me. At first I thought it might be a trick of my tired eyes, the way shadows can play games with your vision on long night runs, but as I adjusted my mirrors and squinted into the darkness, there was no mistaking the hulking silhouette of a big rig keeping pace with me about a quarter-mile back. No running lights, no marker lights, no headlights cutting through the bitter night, just the vague outline of cab and trailer moving through the darkness, like something that didn't quite belong to this world. I tried raising them on the CB, clicking through channels 19, 17 and 21, calling out to the ghost truck behind me, but received nothing in return except the hollow static of empty airwaves. The roads were nearly deserted at this hour, nothing but a few scattered cars and the occasional truck heading in the opposite direction, their headlights creating brief moments of illumination before disappearing back into the vast Maine wilderness. As the miles passed and the temperature continued to drop, now showing -22 degrees, I began to notice something else unusual about my truck's performance. Despite the brutal cold, despite conditions that should have had my fuel system struggling, the engine seemed to be running better than ever. The turbo was spooling with a crisp efficiency I hadn't heard in months. The exhaust note was clean and strong, and the power delivery was smooth as glass. It was as if the extreme cold was somehow improving the fuel's combustion properties rather than hindering them. I pulled into the truck stop in Calais just after 2 in the morning, the parking lot nearly empty except for a handful of rigs, whose drivers were likely sleeping in their bunks, waiting for dawn or warmer temperatures or both. The ghost truck that had been shadowing me was nowhere to be seen, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. I backed into a parking spot near the fuel island and shut down the engine, immediately feeling the cold begin to seep through the cab walls, like a living thing seeking warmth to devour. The fuel nozzle was so cold it almost stuck to my gloves, as I began the routine of filling my tanks. The diesel flowed normally at first, the familiar smell of fuel mixing with the sharp, clean scent of the bitter air. But as I stood there in the cutting wind, watching the gallons tick by on the pump display, I began to notice something that made my skin crawl with unease, that had nothing to do with the temperature, not the normal vapor you might see on a cold day, but actual steam rising from the nozzle and the tank opening, like heat escaping from a boiling kettle. I pulled the nozzle out slightly to get a better look, and what I saw defied every law of thermodynamics I'd ever learned. The diesel fuel was hot, not just warm, but genuinely hot, creating clouds of vapor that dissipated into the frigid air, like ghostly fingers reaching upward into the darkness. Diesel fuel heated by underground storage tanks, I told myself. Some kind of heating system to prevent gelling. But even as I formed the thought, I knew it wasn't right. The fuel was too hot, and the steam too thick, and there was something else. Something in the way the vapor moved that seemed almost purposeful, almost alive. Back in my cab with the engine running, and the heater working to restore feeling to my hands, I tried to push the strange observations from my mind. I had a schedule to keep, a delivery to make, and the sooner I put this unsettling fuel stop behind me, the better. But as I pulled back onto Route 2 and began climbing toward the higher elevations that would take me closer to Bangor, the temperature gauge told a story that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel with growing unease. The outside temperature was now negative 26 degrees, cold enough to kill an unprotected person in minutes, cold enough to freeze diesel solid in the lines. Yet my engine was running hotter than it had all night. Not overheating, but running warmer, as if the fuel I'd just pumped was somehow generating more heat energy than normal diesel should be capable of producing. The exhaust stack was glowing faintly in my mirror, visible heat waves rising from the pipe despite the brutal cold. That's when the ghost truck reappeared. This time it was ahead of me, cresting a hill about half a mile up the road, and for just a moment its silhouette was backlit against the star-filled sky. But as I watched, something about its outline began to change. The trailer seemed to be growing longer, stretching out behind the cab like taffy being pulled, and there was a quality to its movement that suggested it wasn't quite touching the road surface, wasn't quite bound by the same physical laws that governed my own vehicle. I pressed the accelerator, pushing my speed up to 75. Then 80, trying to close the distance and get a better look at what was rapidly becoming the most disturbing thing I'd encountered in more than 2 decades of over-the-road trucking. But no matter how hard I pushed, the ghost truck maintained its distance, always half a mile ahead, always just beyond the reach of my headlights, always slightly wrong in ways that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on it too closely. The fuel gauge showed that I was burning diesel at an alarming rate, far faster than my engine should have been consuming it under normal circumstances. But there was nothing normal about the way the truck was performing. The turbo was screaming with power I'd never felt before, the engine note rising to a pitch that suggested combustion temperatures and pressures that should have destroyed the motor within minutes. Yet everything held together. Everything kept working, as if the laws governing internal combustion had been rewritten by something that understood engines in ways that transcended human engineering. As I crested the same hill where I'd first gotten a clear view of the ghost truck, my headlights swept across a sight that made my blood freeze colder than the air outside my cab. There, stretched across the road like a scene from a nightmare, was what remained of a truck stop that shouldn't have existed. The building was partially collapsed. The fuel pumps were twisted and blackened as if subjected to intense heat, and scattered around the lot were the burned-out husks of trucks and cars, their metal frames warped and melted in patterns that suggested temperatures hot enough to make steel flow like water. But it was the fuel that held my attention, that made me slam on the brakes and bring my truck to a skidding stop just short of the ghostly truck stop's entrance. Every pump, every hose, every connection point was streaming with diesel fuel that glowed with its own inner light, fuel that was boiling and steaming, and giving off heat waves that turned the bitter air into a shimmering mirage of warmth and terror. The fuel was flowing upward, defying gravity, rising into the night sky in spiraling columns of liquid fire that burned without flame. The manuscript highway. From Marcus The first thing you notice about driving nights is how the world becomes a different place entirely. Especially when you're hauling something you've never seen before. I've been running cross-country routes for 15 years now, and I thought I'd carried every kind of cargo imaginable, from livestock to luxury cars, from frozen foods to construction equipment. But when dispatch called me that gray October evening and told me I'd be picking up a specialized trailer from some outfit called Meridian Acquisitions, I should have asked more questions. The pickup location was a warehouse district outside of Portland, Oregon, where the autumn rain had been falling steadily for 3 days straight. My Kenworth's wipers swept rhythmically across the windshield as I navigated the narrow streets between hulking concrete buildings, their windows dark and vacant like empty eye sockets. The address led me to a nondescript gray structure with no signage, just numbers painted in fading white on the loading dock door. A man in an expensive suit waited there with a clipboard, looking entirely out of place among the industrial surrounding. He didn't say much, just handed me the paperwork and pointed to the trailer that would be my companion for the next 2,000 miles to a research facility in North Carolina. It was an unusual rig, sleek and modern, with a matte black finish that seemed to absorb the weak streetlight rather than reflect it. The trailer was completely sealed, no windows or vents visible, and along its sides ran what appeared to be temperature control lines and some kind of pressurization system I'd never encountered before. Maintain steady speeds, avoid sudden stops, and under no circumstances should you attempt to open or inspect the cargo. He paused, studying my face in the dim light. The contents are sensitive to disturbance. I'd heard similar warnings before when transporting art, electronics, or chemical materials, so I simply nodded and performed my standard pre-trip inspection. The trailer hooked up normally enough, though I noticed the connection points were reinforced beyond typical specification. The weight distribution felt strange too, as if the cargo wasn't evenly distributed but rather concentrated in the center of the trailer, with significant empty space around it. As I pulled out of Portland and merged onto Interstate 84, heading east through the Columbia River Gorge, the rain intensified. The rhythmic drumming on my cab roof mixed with the steady hum of my diesel engine and the whisper of tires on wet asphalt. These sounds usually create a meditative backdrop for long night drives, but something felt different this time. There was an underlying vibration, so subtle I initially dismissed it as road surface irregularities, or perhaps a slight wheel imbalance. Miles passed in the darkness, my headlights carving tunnels through the rain as I climbed into the mountains. The radio crackled with distant conversations between other drivers, their voices providing occasional comfort in the isolation. But as the night deepened and I left the last traces of civilization behind, even those voices faded into static. It was somewhere near the Oregon-Idaho border, as I crested a particularly steep grade, that I first noticed the smell. It came through the cab's ventilation system. Despite the trailer being completely sealed, a strange metallic scent mixed with something organic and unpleasant. I checked my gauges, thinking perhaps there was an engine issue or brake problem, but everything registered normal. The smell persisted though, gradually growing stronger as I descended the mountain's eastern slope. By the time I reached Boise, where I planned to fuel up and grab a quick meal, the odor had become nearly overwhelming. It reminded me of old ink, mixed with something that had been left too long in stagnant water. I pulled into a truck stop and walked back to inspect the trailer, my flashlight beam dancing across its unmarked surface. Everything appeared normal until I reached the rear doors. A thin line of dark liquid had appeared along the bottom seal, forming a small puddle on the pavement below. In the harsh fluorescent lights of the truck stop, it looked almost black, with an oily consistency that reflected light in odd patterns. I knelt down for a closer look and immediately regretted it. The smell was 10 times stronger near the leak, and the liquid seemed to move slightly, as if it possessed some kind of internal current. According to my bills of lading, I was supposed to deliver this cargo to the research facility in 36 hours, and I was already behind schedule due to the mountain weather. Against my better judgment, I decided to continue driving and try the contact numbers again in a few hours. Back on the highway, the leak seemed to worsen. I could see a thin trail of the dark substance in my mirrors whenever I passed under overpasses with adequate lighting. The smell in the cab became so intense that I had to breathe through my mouth, and even then it left a metallic taste that lingered unpleasantly. More disturbing was the way the leak seemed to respond to my driving. When I accelerated up hills, the flow increased noticeably. When I braked for curves or traffic, it would surge momentarily, then settle back to its steady seepage. Static would give way to what sounded like voices speaking in a language I couldn't identify, words that seemed to flow and blend together like the liquid trailing behind my trailer. The CB radio occasionally picked up transmissions that made no sense, coordinates being read in monotone voices, technical specifications for equipment I'd never heard of, and most unsettling of all, my own truck number being repeated by someone whose voice sounded oddly familiar. The real fear started around 3 in the morning, as I navigated the winding roads through Utah's mountain passes. In my side mirrors, I began seeing lights that didn't correspond to any other traffic on the road. They would appear as distant points of illumination, keeping pace with my truck despite my varying speeds. When I would slow down to let other vehicles pass, the lights would maintain their relative position. When I accelerated to test them, they would accelerate as well. I pulled over at a rest area to investigate, but the moment my truck came to a complete stop, the lights vanished entirely. The silence was absolute, except for the steady dripping sound coming from beneath the trailer. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight and walked the perimeter of my rig, but found nothing unusual except for the growing puddle of dark liquid, which had now spread in an irregular pattern across several parking spaces. What disturbed me most was that the liquid seemed to be forming shapes, not random spreading like normal fluids, but deliberate patterns that reminded me of letters or symbols from some unknown alphabet. As I watched, the shapes would shift and change, as if the liquid was trying to communicate something. The smell had evolved too, taking on overtones that reminded me of old libraries, musty books, and ink that had sat too long in wells. When I climbed back into my cab and tried to start the engine, it hesitated for several long seconds before turning over. The dashboard lights flickered in sequences that didn't match any normal electrical patterns, and my GPS system kept losing satellite signals despite the clear night sky. The radio now produced only that strange flowing language, spoken in voices that seemed to come from underwater. As I pulled back onto the highway, the trailing lights reappeared immediately, closer now and more numerous. In my mirrors they looked like a convoy of vehicles, but vehicles with headlights arranged in configurations I'd never seen before. Some appeared to have lights mounted vertically along their fronts. Others showed patterns that suggested multiple trailers or unusual equipment configuration. The lights would surge forward whenever the flow increased, then fall back when it diminished. It was as if the dark liquid was some kind of beacon, calling to things that traveled roads I couldn't see. Dawn was still hours away when I crested a ridge and saw the Salt Lake Valley spread out below me, its lights twinkling in the pre-dawn darkness. The sight should have been comforting, representing civilization and help if I needed it, but instead I felt a growing urgency to reach my destination. The liquid trail behind me had become visible even in the darkness, a black line stretching back along the highway like some kind of wave. My radio crackled to life with a clear transmission for the first time in hours. Driver of the northbound Kenworth, this is Utah Highway Patrol. Please respond. My relief was immediate, and I grabbed the microphone quickly. This is the Kenworth, I copy you clear. Sir, we've been receiving reports about your vehicle. Are you experiencing any mechanical difficulties? I explained about the leak, the unusual cargo, and my inability to contact the shipping company. There was a long pause before the trooper responded. Sir, I need you to proceed to the weigh station at exit 1. We have specialists there who need to examine your cargo. Something about his tone made me check my mirrors again. The shadow in the mirror. From Jake Morrison. The thing about driving nights on Highway TOD7 through the Texas Panhandle is how the darkness seems to swallow everything whole, leaving just your headlights carving a narrow tunnel through an ocean of black. I've been pulling freight for 17 years now, and I thought I'd seen every kind of weird the road had to offer. But what happened last October still sits heavy in my chest, like a stone I can't cough up. My rig is a 2018 Peterbilt FUVA 79, midnight blue with chrome, that catches moonlight like water. She purrs smooth as silk when the engine's warm, that steady diesel rumble that becomes a lullaby after enough miles. The cab smells like coffee and the pine air freshener my wife Linda hangs from the mirror before every long haul, and the dashboard glows soft amber in the darkness. Everything was normal that night, or at least it started that way. I was hauling electronics from Dallas to Denver, running about 2 hours behind schedule because of construction delays outside Fort Worth. The load was valuable enough that dispatch wanted me to make up time, so I was pushing through instead of stopping for my usual rest break. The radio crackled with distant trucker chatter, voices floating in and out like ghosts, as I rolled through the small towns that dot the highway like forgotten jewelry. At first I thought it was just another truck running dark, no running lights visible, but headlights maybe a quarter-mile back. Not unusual, really. Some drivers run with minimal lighting to save battery, though it's not exactly legal. But as I watched adjusting my mirror to get a better look, I realized the lights weren't moving the way they should. They stayed perfectly centered behind me, maintaining exact distance, no matter if I sped up or slowed down. The engine hummed beneath me, that familiar vibration through the seat and steering wheel, while the heater whispered warm air across the windshield to keep the October chill at bay. I reached for my CB radio, keying the mic to see if anyone else was running this stretch of highway. Breaker 19, this is Lone Star Jake eastbound on 20. Anyone got their ears on? Static answered me, that empty white noise that fills the spaces between voices in the night. I tried again, adjusting the squelch, but got nothing back. Sometimes the radio goes quiet on these long stretches, especially late at night when most sensible drivers are parked at truck stops catching sleep. But the silence felt different somehow, thicker, like the darkness outside had crept into the airway. I glanced back at my passenger mirror and froze. The headlights were closer now, maybe 50 yards back, but that wasn't what made my blood run cold. In the space between those two bright points of light, I could swear I saw the outline of a cab, but it was wrong somehow. The proportions didn't match any truck I'd ever seen. Too tall, too narrow, like someone had stretched a normal 18-wheeler through a funhouse mirror. The speedometer showed I was doing 73, 3 over the limit, but nothing crazy. I eased off the throttle, dropping down to 65, figuring whoever was back there could pass if they were in a hurry. But the lights stayed put, matching my speed perfectly. The distance between us never changed, not by so much as a foot. My coffee had gone cold in the cup holder, and when I reached for it, my hand was shaking just slightly. The dashboard clock read 12:47 a.m., and the next town was still 30 miles ahead. Nothing but empty prairie stretched out on both sides of the highway, broken only by the occasional oil derrick or abandoned farmhouse. The wind had picked up, buffeting the trailer, and making the whole rig sway gently from side to side. I tried the radio again, this time switching to channel 19, the main trucking frequency. This is Blue Pete, eastbound, on 2087. Anyone copy? For a moment nothing. Then, through the static, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It sounded like my own voice, distant and distorted, saying Blue Pete eastbound on 2087. Anyone copy? But I wasn't keying the mic. My hands were on the steering wheel, knuckles white in the dashboard light. The headlights in my mirror seemed to pulse, growing brighter and dimmer in a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. I blinked hard, thinking maybe I was more tired than I'd realized. But when I looked again, they were definitely pulsing, and they were closer, much closer. I pressed down on the accelerator, feeling the turbo kick in as the big cat engine responded. The speedometer climbed to 75, then 80. The trailer swayed more noticeably now, but I needed to put some distance between me and whatever was following. But when I checked the mirror, those pulsing lights were right there, maybe 20 yards back, keeping perfect pace. That's when I saw the driver, but it was wrong. All wrong. Too tall for the cab, hunched forward over the steering wheel, with arms that seemed to stretch and bend in ways that hurt to look at. And where the face should have been, there was only darkness. A void that seemed to pull at my eyes like a black hole. The radio crackled to life again, and this time I heard my own voice clearly, saying words I'd never spoken. Can't stop driving. Can never stop driving. Gotta make the delivery. Gotta make the delivery. The voice was mine but hollow, echoing like it was coming from the bottom of a well. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pushed the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared, turbo whistling, speedometer climbing past 85. The whole rig shook with the effort, trailer tires screaming on the asphalt, but I had to get away from that thing behind me. The wind through the slightly open window sounded like whispers now, syllables I couldn't quite make out. But that filled me with a deep primal fear. Up ahead I could see the glow of the next town, Dalhart, still 15 miles away, but getting closer. I focused on that glow like a beacon, something real and normal in a night that had gone completely sideways. The fuel gauge showed I still had plenty of diesel, and the engine temperature was holding steady. The truck was running fine, but I felt like I was losing my mind. When I looked in the mirror again, the following truck was gone. Empty highway stretching back into darkness. No headlights, no impossible silhouette, nothing. I eased off the accelerator, letting my speed drop back to legal limits, and tried to convince myself I'd been hallucinating from exhaustion. Maybe I'd been seeing the reflection of my own headlights somehow, my tired brain playing tricks in the dark. But as I rolled through Dalhart, past the closed gas stations and darkened storefronts, I caught a glimpse of something in my driver's side mirror that made my blood freeze. There, reflected in the glass, was my own face. But I was smiling, a wide, empty grin that I wasn't making. My reflection's hands were on the steering wheel, but my real hands were reaching for my coffee cup. I jerked my eyes back to the road, afraid to look in any mirror now. The radio hissed with static, and somewhere in that white noise, I could swear I heard laughter. My own laughter, but not my own, if that makes any sense. Like something else was using my voice, my face, my reflection, to play games in the dark. I drove the rest of the way to Denver without stopping, windows down despite the cold, radio off, mirrors adjusted so I could barely see anything but the road ahead. Every time I felt the urge to check behind me, I gripped the steering wheel tighter and focused on the white lines disappearing under my bumper. The engine's steady rumble became my anchor to reality, that and the familiar vibration of the road through the tire. When I finally backed up to the loading dock in Denver, just after sunrise, I was exhausted and shaky, but grateful to be around other people. The dock workers were cheerful and normal, complaining about the weather and cracking jokes as they unloaded my trailer. Everything felt solid and real again. But here's the thing that still haunts me. When I was doing my post-trip inspection, walking around the rig to check for damage or wear, I found something that shouldn't have been there. On the back of my trailer, written in dust that looked like it had been traced by a finger, were the words "Thanks for the ride." The dust was fresh, no rain had fallen during the night, and the trailer had been clean when I'd started the trip. The Sleeper Song, from Marcus Aurelius. The thing about long-haul trucking is that loneliness becomes a living creature riding shotgun with you mile after mile, especially on those routes that stretch across the Nevada desert, where civilization exists only in the occasional flicker of distant lights. I'd been driving my Peterbilt 3709 for nearly 15 years, and I thought I'd experienced every variety of passenger the road could offer, from chatty salesmen to silent drifters, clutching worn duffel bags. But nothing had prepared me for the man who flagged me down outside of Tonopah on that October night when the air carried the first sharp bite of winter. He emerged from the shadows beside a broken-down Greyhound station that had been abandoned for at least a decade, his thumb raised in the universal gesture of hope. The sodium streetlights cast everything in that sickly yellow glow that makes the world look like it's drowning in amber. And through my windshield I could see he was ordinary enough, maybe 50 years old, with graying hair and a worn leather jacket that had seen better decades. His face held that particular exhaustion that comes from being stranded in the middle of nowhere, the kind of bone-deep weariness I recognized from my own reflection during those brutal cross-country runs. I pulled the air brakes and listened to the familiar hiss as my rig settled to a stop, the diesel engine maintaining its steady rumble like a mechanical heartbeat. The passenger door swung open with its customary creak, and he climbed up into the cab with movements that seemed careful, deliberate, as though he were concentrating on each step. When he settled into the worn vinyl seat, I caught a whiff of something I couldn't quite identify, something that reminded me of old books and dried flowers, the scent of things preserved beyond their natural time. "Much obliged," he said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested too many cigarettes, or perhaps just the desert air, wearing away at vocal cords over time. "Name's Henry, heading east. Anywhere east will do fine." There was something about the way he spoke that suggested careful consideration, as though words were precious things not to be wasted on unnecessary conversation. The road stretched ahead like a black ribbon thrown across the desert floor, marked only by the occasional reflective sign catching our headlight. Henry sat quietly beside me, hands folded in his lap, occasionally gazing out at the endless expanse of sagebrush and stone that defined this part of the world. He made appropriate small talk about the weather, the condition of the roads, the way Nevada seemed to go on forever without changing. His observations were thoughtful, even insightful, and I found myself appreciating the company after 3 days of driving alone through increasingly desolate country. The radio crackled with distant trucker chatter, mixing with the steady drone of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. It was somewhere past midnight when Henry's breathing began to change, settling into the deeper rhythm that indicated approaching sleep. I'd grown accustomed to passengers nodding off, understanding that the combination of road vibration and engine noise created a surprisingly effective lullaby for tired travelers. The darkness outside had become absolute except for our headlights carving through the night, creating the sensation that we were the only living things moving through this vast emptiness. That's when the humming began, so quietly at first that I thought it might be some new vibration in the engine, or perhaps interference from the radio. But gradually I realized it was coming from Henry, a soft melodic sound that seemed to emanate from deep in his chest. The tune was unlike anything I'd ever heard, not quite a lullaby but possessing that same hypnotic quality that makes melodies stick in your mind long after the music stops. The engine, which had been running with its usual steady rhythm, began to synchronize with Henry's melody, as though the mechanical heartbeat of my Peterbilt was trying to match the organic rhythm of his breathing. Even more unsettling was the way the radio static seemed to organize itself around the humming, creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible from random electromagnetic interference. His eyes were closed, face peaceful in sleep, but his mouth wasn't moving. The humming continued, clear and musical, but it seemed to be coming from somewhere else, perhaps from his chest or throat in a way that bypassed his lips entirely. In the green glow of the dashboard lights, his skin appeared waxy, almost translucent, and I could swear I saw something moving beneath the surface, like shadows swimming just under ice. It wasn't unpleasant, quite the opposite actually, but it carried with it a sense of profound sadness, as though it were the musical expression of every loss, every goodbye, every moment of regret that had ever existed. I found my own breathing beginning to match its rhythm, my heartbeat syncing with its cadence, and somewhere in the back of my mind a small voice of alarm was trying to warn me that this wasn't natural, wasn't right. Mile markers flickered past like sentinels marking our progress through the night, but I began to notice that something was wrong with the distance. We'd been driving for what felt like hours since Henry fell asleep, yet the GPS showed we'd only traveled a few miles from where I'd picked him up. The speedometer read 70 miles per hour, The engine was running normally, but somehow we weren't making any real progress across the landscape. The humming grew stronger, more complex, and I realized it wasn't just one melody, but multiple harmonies weaving together in impossible ways. It was as though Henry contained an entire choir, each voice adding its own thread to a tapestry of sound that was becoming increasingly hypnotic. The truck's engine had fallen completely in sync now, its diesel rumble providing a bass note that seemed to anchor all the other sounds to something solid and real. Outside the windows, the desert had begun to change in ways that defied explanation. The familiar scrubland was giving way to landscapes I didn't recognize. Formations of stone and sand that seemed to shift and flow like water when I wasn't looking directly at them. The stars above had arranged themselves into patterns that hurt to contemplate, constellations that suggested geometries my mind couldn't quite process. I tried to wake Henry, reaching over to shake his shoulder gently, but my hand passed through him as though he were made of mist. The leather jacket felt real enough, solid and textured under my fingers, but the man wearing it had become something else, something that existed between dimensions. His humming never faltered, never changed, and his peaceful expression remained constant even as I frantically tried to establish some kind of physical contact. The realization hit me then with the weight of absolute certainty. I was no longer driving through the Nevada desert on Highway 6. We had passed into somewhere else, somewhere that existed in the spaces between notes of Henry's impossible song. The truck was still moving, still consuming diesel and marking miles on the odometer, but we were traveling through a realm where distance and time followed different rules. The humming reached a crescendo that seemed to encompass every sound the truck had ever made, every mile it had ever traveled, every passenger it had ever carried. I could hear echoes of conversations from years past, the voices of travelers who had sat in Henry's seat and shared their stories with me across countless nights. But underneath it all was something darker, a harmony that spoke of journeys that never ended, of passengers who had climbed into trucks and never climbed back out. The truck shuddered to a stop, air brakes hissing their protest, and in that moment of mechanical rebellion against the impossible, Henry's humming faltered for just an instant. It was enough. Reality seemed to snap back into focus, like a rubber band released after being stretched too far. The desert outside was once again the familiar Nevada landscape, complete with the proper constellations wheeling overhead and mile markers that made sense according to the laws of time and distance. Henry sat beside me, solid and real, his eyes opening slowly as though he were waking from a particularly deep sleep. In the dashboard lights, his face looked perfectly normal. No trace of the translucent quality I'd observed during his strange slumber. I told him everything was fine, that I just needed to check something with the engine, but my hands were shaking as I released the brakes and eased back onto the highway. For the next 2 hours, Henry remained awake, making pleasant conversation about his destination and sharing stories about his travels that seemed perfectly ordinary. When we reached the truck stop in Ali where he asked to be let off, he thanked me politely and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness without looking back. The bridge that never was. From Marcus Chen, the rain had been falling for 3 hours straight when I first saw the overpass that shouldn't have existed. I'd been driving the stretch of Interstate 87 through upstate New York for the better part of 2 decades, hauling everything from furniture to frozen goods in my trusty Peterbilt. The chrome stacks hummed their familiar tune as the wipers swept rhythmically across the windshield, creating momentary windows of clarity in the storm that had turned the October night into a curtain of silver threads. I knew every mile marker, every exit ramp, every bridge and overpass between Albany and the Canadian border, like I knew the calluses on my own hands. The highway was as familiar to me as my own heartbeat, which is why the concrete structure looming ahead in my headlights made my coffee grow cold in its thermos. Where there should have been nothing but rolling hills and dark pine forests, an overpass stretched across the interstate like a concrete rainbow, its support pillars disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness on either side. My CB radio crackled with static as I reached for the handset, thumb hovering over the talk button. The logical part of my mind searched for explanations. Construction projects could move fast these days, and I hadn't run this route in nearly 3 weeks. Maybe the state had pushed through some emergency infrastructure work, though it seemed unlikely they'd managed to pour, cure, and finish an entire overpass in that time. The concrete looked weathered, aged, as if it had been standing there for decades rather than days. The engine's diesel rumble deepened as I maintained my speed, approaching the structure that cast long shadows across the wet asphalt. My headlights illuminated the underside of the bridge, revealing smooth concrete that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There were no construction signs, no orange barrels or warning lights, nothing to indicate recent work, just this impossible bridge spanning the highway where no bridge had ever been before. As I passed underneath, I caught a glimpse of movement in my mirror. Something had been standing on the overpass, a dark silhouette against the storm clouds, but when I looked again, there was nothing but empty concrete and falling rain. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather crept down my spine. I'd been driving long enough to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was telling me something was fundamentally wrong with what I'd just experienced. The diner's neon sign flickered erratically, casting red and blue shadows across the rain-slicked parking lot as I backed my rig into a space between two other semis. Inside, the familiar smell of coffee and bacon grease provided some comfort as I approached the counter where Dolores, the night shift waitress, was wiping down coffee cups with practiced efficiency. "Evening, Marcus," she said without looking up. "Rough night to be on the road." "That's for sure," I replied, sliding onto a vinyl-covered stool. "Dolores, you been here long tonight?" "Tetlai. Since 6. Why?" "Tetlai. Any other drivers mention anything unusual about the highway? Maybe some new construction?" "Tetlai." She paused in her wiping, fixing me with a look that suggested she'd heard stranger questions, but not many. "What kind of construction?" "State's broke as usual. Haven't seen any road work around here in months." I described the overpass, watching her expression grow more puzzled with each detail. By the time I finished, she was shaking her head slowly, the kind of head shake that suggested I might have been on the road too long. "Marcus, honey, I've been working this stretch for 15 years, and my daddy worked the county road crew before that. There's no overpass where you're describing. Nothing but forest and farmland for miles in either direction." The coffee she poured tasted bitter despite the sugar I added. I tried to convince myself that the storm had played tricks with my perception, that the darkness and rain had transformed some familiar landmark into something foreign and unsettling. But the image remained crystal clear in my memory. Concrete pillars, weathered surface, and that silhouette watching from above. 2 hours later, I was back on the road, the storm having diminished to a light drizzle that caught my headlights like scattered diamonds. The radio played old country songs between bursts of static as I retraced my route, curiosity overcoming caution. I needed to see that overpass again, needed to prove to myself that it was real and explainable. Just another piece of infrastructure on a highway I thought I knew completely. The mile markers ticked by in their familiar sequence, but as I approached the spot where the bridge should have been, my headlights illuminated nothing but empty highway stretching into the distance. The pine forests pressed close to the road on both sides, just as they always had, their dark branches heavy with moisture. There was no overpass, no concrete structure, nothing but the two-lane interstate cutting through the wilderness like it had for decades. I pulled onto the shoulder and climbed down from the cab, my boots splashing in roadside puddles as I walked to where I was certain the bridge had stood. The asphalt showed no signs of recent construction, no scars where heavy equipment might have operated. I knelt and ran my fingers along the road surface, feeling for seams or patches that might indicate recent work, but found only the familiar rough texture of aged highway. The sensation was so strong it made my skin crawl, as if unseen eyes were cataloging my every movement. I turned slowly, scanning the dark spaces between the pine trunks, but saw nothing except shadows and the occasional glint of moisture on bark. The feeling persisted, growing stronger, until I found myself backing toward my truck with increasing urgency. The CB radio was alive with chatter when I climbed back into the cab, drivers discussing weather conditions and road closures throughout the region. I listened for several minutes before keying the handset. "This is Big Bear eastbound on 87, I said, using my old handle. "Anyone else run this stretch tonight?" "What?" A gravelly voice responded immediately. "Iron Horse here, westbound about an hour ago. Roads clear but slick. You having problems, Big Bear?" "Negative, Iron Horse. Just wondering if you noticed anything unusual around mile marker. Any construction or new structures?" There was a long pause before he responded. "Can't say I did, Big Bear. Everything looked normal to me. You sure you got the right mile marker?" I confirmed the location twice, but neither Iron Horse nor two other drivers who joined the conversation had seen anything out of the ordinary. Their voices carried the casual concern that truckers reserved for fellow drivers who might be pushing too hard or losing their grip on reality. I signed off without pressing the issue further, but their skepticism only deepened the unease that had been growing since I first saw the impossible bridge. The following week brought an early snow that dusted the highways with treacherous beauty, and I found myself running the same route with a load of winter clothing bound for Montreal. Daylight revealed the familiar landscape in sharp detail: rolling hills, dense forests, and farmlands, divided by stone walls that predated the interstate by generations. There was no overpass at mile marker 127, no evidence that one had ever existed or was planned for the future. But as darkness fell and snow began to accumulate on my windshield, I found myself watching the road ahead with nervous anticipation. The wipers swept back and forth in their mechanical rhythm, and the heater hummed steadily as I approached the spot where I'd seen the impossible structure. Part of me hoped it would appear again, if only to prove I hadn't been hallucinating, while another part dreaded the sight of concrete pillars rising from the snowy ground. The overpass materialized out of the swirling snow like something from a dream, its surfaces now dusted with white that seemed to glow in my headlight. It stood exactly where it had before, spanning the highway with the same weathered authority, as if it had been part of the landscape for generations. This time, however, I was ready for it. I grabbed my phone from the dashboard mount, determined to capture photographic evidence of the structure that seemed to exist only under specific conditions. The flash fired automatically, illuminating the concrete surface above me for a split second. In that brief moment of artificial daylight, I saw them clearly: human figures standing along the edge of the overpass, dozens of them, all looking down at my truck as I passed underneath. My hands shook as I checked the phone's display, but the photo showed only darkness and snow, as if the camera had captured nothing but empty night sky. I pulled over immediately and scrolled through the image repeatedly, zooming in on every pixel, but found no trace of the bridge or the figures I'd seen so clearly. The Whispering Miles. From Marcus Rivera Dia. The old Kenworth had been sitting on the lot for 3 months when I finally scraped together enough for the down payment. Danny, the dealer, seemed almost relieved to see it go, though he claimed it was just because of the paperwork piling up. The truck was a beauty from the outside, forest green paint job still gleaming despite being 15 years old, chrome bumpers that caught the afternoon sun like mirrors. What caught my attention wasn't the pristine exterior though, it was the price. $20,000 below market value for a rig in that condition meant something was wrong. But I'd been driving company trucks for 8 years and was desperate to own my own. Danny walked me around the cab one more time, his hands shoved deep in his coverall pockets, eyes focused anywhere but on mine. The interior was immaculate, leather seats barely showing wear, dashboard polished to a shine. Even the sleeper berth looked like it had never been used, the mattress still holding its factory firmness. I ran my fingers along the steering wheel, feeling the subtle texture of the leather wrap, imagining all the miles this truck had seen. Previous owner was meticulous, Danny muttered, kicking at a loose piece of gravel. Real particular about maintenance, changed the oil every 3,000 miles, kept detailed logs of everything. He paused, glancing up at the cab. Real quiet type, kept to himself mostly, said the truck understood him better than most people did. The way Danny said it made something cold settle in my stomach. But I pushed the feeling aside. People said all sorts of things about their rigs. Truckers were a superstitious bunch. The first few weeks were everything I'd dreamed they'd be. The Kenworth handled like a dream, engine purring with a steady rhythm that seemed to sync with my heartbeat during those long midnight stretches. The cab was whisper quiet, even at highway speeds. The insulation so good that sometimes I felt like I was floating through space rather than rolling down asphalt. I named her Whisper because of how smoothly she ran, how the engine barely made a sound even when climbing steep grades with a full load. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, fighting to keep my eyes open despite the thermos of coffee I'd been nursing. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, picking up nothing but fragments of distant stations that faded in and out like ghosts. I'd been talking to myself, a habit I'd developed over the years of solo driving, just commenting on the scenery or working through problems out loud. The words felt comfortable in the quiet cab, my voice the only human sound for miles in any direction. That's when I heard it. So soft I almost convinced myself it was the wind or maybe the whisper of tires on pavement. But the sound seemed to come from directly in front of me, from the dashboard itself. Fuel in 20 miles, came the whisper, so faint I had to strain to make out the words. Coffee at the truck stop. I hit the brakes harder than I meant to, the trailer swaying slightly as I pulled onto the shoulder. My hands were shaking as I turned off the engine, the sudden silence pressing against my eardrums like cotton. I sat there for 10 minutes, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant howl of wind through the desert. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the CB radio was picking up some frequency I wasn't aware of. Maybe another driver had been commenting on the same stretch of road. But when I fired up the engine and pulled back onto the highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice had been too clear, too immediate, too perfectly timed to be coincident. And sure enough, 18 miles later, the familiar glow of a truck stop broke the darkness ahead, its neon signs promising fuel and coffee and human company. The next few nights passed without incident, but I found myself listening more carefully to the sounds of the cab, the way the air conditioning whispered through the vents, the soft electrical hum of the dashboard lights. I started talking to myself more frequently, making casual observations about the weather or the road conditions, always listening for that soft response that I was half hoping I'd imagine. I was crawling along at 40 miles per hour, knuckles white on the steering wheel, trying to follow the taillights of the semi ahead of me through the whirling snow. The road was getting treacherous, black ice forming under the fresh powder, and I was starting to wonder if I should pull over and wait it out. Exit in 2 miles, came the response. Clearer this time, definitely originating from somewhere inside the cab. Truck stop has parking. Safe there. This time I didn't brake or pull over. Instead, I felt an odd sense of gratitude, as if someone was looking out for me in the storm. And when the exit appeared exactly 2 miles later, marked by a blue sign advertising a travel plaza, I took it without hesitation. The parking lot was nearly full of other drivers who'd had the same idea, and I managed to squeeze into one of the last spots, the engine ticking as it cooled in the swirling snow. At first they were purely practical, helpful even. Warnings about construction zones before I could see the signs, suggestions for routes that would avoid traffic jams, alerts about way stations that were open or closed. The voice, when I could make it out clearly, sounded neither male nor female, but something in between, as if it were coming from a great distance, or through layers of static. I started testing it, asking direct questions in a whisper. "How's the weather ahead?" I'd ask, and sometimes the truck would respond with details about approaching storms or clear skies. "Any bears on this stretch?" and I'd get warnings about speed traps or DOT inspections. It was like having the perfect driving partner, someone who knew the roads better than any GPS system and had access to real-time information that I couldn't get from the radio or CB. But gradually, the responses began to change. Instead of just answering my questions, the truck started making suggestions of its own. "Take the back road," it would whisper as I approached an intersection with multiple route options. "Avoid the main highway tonight." At first, these suggestions led me away from traffic or road construction, saving me time and hassle. But increasingly, they seemed to be leading me down darker, more isolated routes, through countryside where the only lights were distant farmhouses and the occasional gas station glowing like a beacon in the emptiness. The whispers began to come even when I hadn't spoken first, soft suggestions that seemed to rise from the dashboard in the darkest hours before dawn. "Turn left at the next junction," the voice would say, even when my GPS indicated I should go straight. "Take the mountain route, more interesting that way." And I found myself following these suggestions, curious about where they might lead, telling myself that I was just exploring alternate routes, getting to know the roads better. It was on one of these detours, somewhere in the mountains of West Virginia, that I began to understand that something was fundamentally wrong. The road the truck had guided me to was little more than a logging trail, winding through dense forest where the headlights seemed to be swallowed by the darkness between the trees. I'd been following the whispered directions for over an hour, each turn taking me further from the main highway, deeper into terrain that my atlas didn't show in any detail. "Where are we going?" I finally asked aloud, my voice sounding small and uncertain in the quiet cab. "Home," came the whispered response, and for the first time, there was something like emotion in that distant voice. "Taking you home, Tisa," but I was already home when I was in the cab, or at least that's what I'd always told myself. Home was wherever I parked for the night, wherever I could get a hot meal and a shower, and 8 hours of sleep before hitting the road again. The truck's version of home seemed to be something else entirely, someplace specific that I was being guided toward whether I wanted to go there or not. I tried to turn around, but the road had narrowed to the point where there was barely room for the truck to fit between the trees. The whispers became more insistent, more frequent, offering directions for turns I couldn't see until my headlights swept across them. "Left here, right at the fallen log, straight through the clearing." And I found myself following these instructions, partly because I didn't see any other choice, and partly because I was beginning to suspect that the truck would find a way to guide itself even if I tried to resist. The rest stop, where clocks forgot to turn. From Marcus Chen, I've been hauling freight across the interstate for nearly 2 decades now, and I thought I'd seen every mile marker, every truck stop, every lonely stretch of asphalt between here and the horizon. My Kenworth W900 and I have rolled through snowstorms that turned the world white as static, through desert heat that made the air shimmer like broken glass, through nights so dark they seemed to swallow my headlights whole. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened at that rest area, just outside of Nowhere, Nevada, where time itself seemed to have pulled over and forgotten to get back on the road. It was 3:17 in the morning when I first spotted the sign, illuminated by my high beams like a ghost stepping into the light. The reflective letters spelled out Desert Springs Rest Area, 2 miles in that familiar green and white that every trucker knows by heart. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, pushing the legal limit, and my eyelids felt heavy as lead weights. The coffee had long since worn off, leaving behind that familiar bitter aftertaste and the jittery exhaustion that comes from too much caffeine and too little sleep. My CB radio crackled with the occasional transmission from other night owls on the road, but mostly it was just static, and the steady hum of my diesel engine keeping me company. The desert stretched out on both sides of the highway like a vast empty ocean frozen in time. Sagebrush and Joshua trees stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, their twisted shapes looking like ancient sentinels watching over this desolate stretch of Nevada wilderness. The air conditioning hummed steadily, fighting against the residual heat that still radiated from the sun-baked earth, even hours after sunset. Through my windshield, I could see the heat shimmer rising from the asphalt ahead, creating strange, wavering distortions in my headlight beam. When the rest area finally appeared, it looked ordinary enough in that standardized, government-issued way that all highway facilities seem to share. The entrance was marked by the usual brown wooden sign, with carved letters painted white, though the paint looked fresher than it should have for a facility this far out in the middle of nowhere. Solar-powered lights lined the curved drive that led to the parking area, casting pools of pale yellow light that seemed somehow dimmer than they should have been, as if the bulbs were running low on power, or the desert air itself was absorbing the illumination. I downshifted and pulled into the truck parking section, the air brakes hissing as I brought my rig to a stop between two sets of yellow lines that had been painted with mathematical precision. The parking area could accommodate maybe a dozen big rigs, but mine was the only one. This struck me as odd, considering it was prime driving time for long haulers trying to beat the morning traffic or make up time on tight delivery schedules. Usually rest areas like this were busy around the clock, with drivers catching mandatory rest breaks or grabbing quick naps between legal driving periods. As I shut down the engine, the sudden silence felt almost oppressive. No wind rustling through desert vegetation, no distant highway noise, not even the usual chorus of crickets or coyotes that typically provided the soundtrack for Nevada nights. Just absolute, complete silence that seemed to press against my eardrums like cotton. I sat there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness beyond my headlights, and noticed something that made me pause. The facility looked remarkably well maintained for such a remote location. The restroom building was constructed of tan brick with a red tile roof, and it appeared to be in perfect condition. No graffiti, no weather damage, no signs of the usual wear and tear that highway facilities accumulate over years of use in desert weather. Stepping down from my cab, I was struck by how still the air was, not a breath of wind, which was unusual for desert terrain, where temperature differences typically create constant air movement. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat and the soft whisper of my breathing. Even my footsteps seemed muted as I walked across the asphalt toward the restroom facility, as if the very air was absorbing sound. The building had the typical layout of highway rest stops, separate entrances for men and women, with a covered area in between that housed vending machines and informational displays. But as I approached, I noticed details that seemed subtly wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The vending machines were there, but they contained products I didn't recognize. Soft drinks with brand names that looked almost familiar but not quite right. Snack foods in packaging that seemed like simultaneously retro and futuristic. The information boards displayed maps and tourist attractions, but the dates on the brochures were missing, and the photographs looked like they'd been taken with cameras from decades past, all slightly overexposed and unnaturally bright. The mirrors reflected my tired face clearly, the stainless steel fixtures gleamed, and the floor was spotless. But there was something about the fluorescent lighting that bothered me. It flickered occasionally, but not in the random failing pattern of old bulbs. Instead, it seemed to pulse rhythmically, like a mechanical heartbeat. The light itself had an unusual quality, casting shadows that seemed deeper and more defined than they should have been. When I emerged from the facility, I decided to check out the covered picnic area that stretched alongside the parking space. Desert Springs Rest Area was apparently designed for families and tourists as well as truckers, with several concrete picnic tables positioned under a long metal roof supported by sturdy posts. Each table had a barbecue grill nearby, though they showed no signs of recent use. The concrete was perfectly smooth and unmarked, without the chips, stains, and carved initials that accumulate on heavily used public furniture. It was a simple round clock with black numbers on a white face, the kind you might find in an elementary school classroom or a government office. The hands pointed to 3:17, which matched the time I'd arrived. I glanced at my watch to compare, and felt a small chill run down my spine. My watch also showed 3:17. But I'd been at the rest area for at least 15 minutes. I tapped the crystal thinking the movement might have stopped, but the second hand was moving steadily. Puzzled, I walked back to my truck to check the digital clock on my dashboard. It also displayed 3:17. The CB radio's clock function showed the same time. Even my cell phone, when I pulled it from my pocket, insisted that it was still 3:17 in the morning. I stood there in the pale glow of the solar lights, looking from my watch to my phone to my truck's dashboard, watching the second hands move and the digital displays change, but always returning to 3:17. A rational explanation existed. Of course, all my timepieces could have malfunctioned simultaneously, though that seemed unlikely. Or perhaps I was more tired than I'd realized, and my perception of time was distorted. Long-haul driving can play tricks on your mind, especially during those deep hours of the night, when your circadian rhythms are at their lowest ebb. I'd experienced time distortion before, moments when miles passed without memory or hours compressed into what felt like minutes. But as I stood there in the unnatural stillness of Desert Springs rest area, staring at timepieces that refused to acknowledge the passage of minutes, I began to feel a growing unease that went beyond simple confusion. There was something fundamentally wrong with this place, something that made the hair on my arms stand up and my instincts scream that I should get back in my truck and drive away as fast as possible. I decided to test my theory by walking to the far end of the parking area, deliberately taking my time and counting my steps. 147 paces brought me to the edge of the facility, where the maintained grounds gave way to natural desert vegetation. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, watching a distant star and trying to detect any movement in its position that might indicate the passage of time. Then I walked slowly back to my truck, again counting steps and trying to estimate elapsed time. My watch still showed 3:17. According to every timepiece I carried, I'd been at Desert Springs rest area for 0 minutes, despite clear evidence that I'd been walking around, using the facilities, and exploring the ground. I tried calling my dispatcher, thinking that perhaps talking to someone in the outside world might break whatever strange spell had settled over this place. But my cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't particularly unusual in remote desert locations. CB radio was equally useless, producing nothing but static when I tried to reach other truckers on the highway. The logical thing to do was leave, get back on the interstate, drive until I reached an area where time flowed normally and my electronics functioned properly. But something kept me there, a mixture of curiosity and professional skepticism that demanded a rational explanation. The sirens lament. For Marcus, I've been running these mountain routes for near 20 years now, and I thought I'd heard every sound a diesel engine could make. The growl of a cold start on a February morning, the wheeze of worn injectors climbing steep grades, the satisfied purr of 18 wheels eating up highway miles in perfect harmony. But what came from my exhaust pipe that October night, well, that was something else entirely. The evening started ordinary enough. I was hauling a load of furniture from a manufacturing plant in Tennessee, bound for a distribution center outside Denver. Nothing unusual about the cargo, nothing strange about the route. My Peterbilt 389 had been running smooth as silk since her last service. All systems green across the dashboard. The weather was crisp but clear, with that particular autumn bite that makes you grateful for a warm cab and hot coffee. I was making good time through the winding passes of eastern Kentucky when I first noticed something different about the engine's exhaust note. It was subtle at first, just a slight variation in the familiar rumble that emerged from the tall chrome stack behind my sleeper. Instead of the usual steady growl, there seemed to be an almost musical quality creeping in, like someone was running their finger around the rim of a wine glass in perfect rhythm with the engine's RPM. At first I chalked it up to altitude changes affecting the exhaust pressure, or maybe some kind of harmonic resonance caused by the mountain terrain. These old hills can play tricks with sound, creating echoes and distortions that make you question what you're hearing. I adjusted the radio volume and kept my foot steady on the accelerator, watching the tachometer needle dance between 1500 and 1800 RPMs, as the transmission worked through the gears on each climbing stretch. But as the miles rolled by and the sun disappeared behind the jagged silhouette of pine-covered ridges, the sound grew more distinct. What had started as a barely perceptible whistle was evolving into something that genuinely resembled music. Not random notes or mechanical noise, but actual melodic phrases that seemed to rise and fall with deliberate intention. The tone was hauntingly beautiful, like a distant flute or perhaps a human voice humming a lullaby just beyond the edge of hearing. I pulled into a truck stop near Hazard to top off my fuel and grab some dinner, thinking that maybe a brief shutdown would reset whatever acoustic anomaly was affecting my exhaust system. The familiar ritual of backing up to the diesel pumps, checking my logs, and stretching my legs in the fluorescent glow of the station lights felt reassuring and normal. Other drivers nodded their acknowledgement as they passed, everyone going through the same routine that defines our nomadic existence. The chrome was clean, the mounting brackets secure, no visible damage or obstruction that might explain the unusual sound. I even climbed up on the fuel tank step to peer down into the pipe, but saw nothing except the expected darkness and the faint shimmer of heat distortion from residual exhaust gases. The attendant, a weathered man with grease-stained coveralls and knowing eyes, ambled over as I was completing my inspection. "She singing to you tonight?" he asked, with a slight grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. The question was so unexpected and specific that it stopped me cold. "Excuse me?" I replied, though something in his expression suggested he already knew exactly what I was experiencing. "That old Peterbilt of yours," he continued, nodding toward my truck. "Beautiful voice she's got. Heard her when you pulled in. Been a while since one of them came through here singing like that." He paused to spit tobacco juice into a styrofoam cup, then fixed me with a stare that seemed to carry years of accumulated highway wisdom. "You'd best be careful listening too close to that song, driver. Sometimes they sing you right off the road." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked back toward the station office, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. The casual way he'd mentioned it, as if singing exhaust pipes were as common as flat tires or blown fuses, sent an odd chill through my chest despite the mild evening air. I finished fueling and grabbed a quick sandwich from the deli counter, but found myself hurrying through the usually leisurely routine of a fuel stop. Something about the attendant's warning, delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty, had unsettled me more than I cared to admit. I was eager to get back on the road, to put some distance between myself and his cryptic words. For the first few miles the exhaust sounded completely normal, just the steady diesel rumble that had been my constant companion for 2 decades of over-the-road hauling. I began to relax, convinced that whatever acoustic quirk I'd been experiencing had resolved itself during the shutdown. But as I climbed into the higher elevations of the Appalachian foothills, the singing returned. This time there was no mistaking it for mechanical noise or atmospheric distortion. The sound flowing from my exhaust pipe was undeniably musical, a wordless melody that seemed to weave itself through the engine's fundamental frequency like silk thread through burlap. The tune was melancholy and beautiful, with a haunting quality that reminded me of half-remembered lullabies from childhood. It wasn't loud or intrusive, but rather seemed to blend perfectly with the other sounds of the highway. The whisper of tires on asphalt, the gentle hum of the air conditioning, the rhythmic clicking of expansion joints in the pavement. If anything, the singing seemed to enhance these familiar sounds, creating a symphony of motion that was both soothing and deeply hypnotic. As the night deepened and traffic thinned to the occasional set of headlights in my mirrors, I realized I was no longer paying close attention to my speed or my position on the road. The melody had somehow captured my full attention, drawing me into a kind of waking dream where nothing existed except the truck, the highway, and that impossibly beautiful song flowing from the chrome exhaust stack. The music seemed to be telling a story without words, painting images in my mind of distant places and forgotten memories. I saw moonlight on still water, wind-carved rock formations, reaching toward star-filled skies, endless fields of wheat, bending in waves before harvest storms. The visions felt more real than the actual highway stretching ahead of my headlights, more substantial than the dashboard gauges and the familiar weight of the steering wheel in my hands. It wasn't until I felt the truck drifting toward the center line that I snapped back to full awareness. The yellow stripes were sliding under my front bumper, and I had to make a sharp correction to bring the rig back into my lane. My heart hammered as I realized how completely the singing had captured my attention, how close I'd come to crossing into oncoming traffic without even noticing. I rolled down the window and turned up the radio, trying to break the hypnotic spell of the exhaust pipe's melody. But even with cold mountain air rushing through the cab and classic rock pounding from the speakers, I could still hear that ethereal tune weaving through everything else, persistent and alluring as a siren's call. The next few hours became a battle of wills between my professional driving instincts and the increasingly compelling song emerging from my truck's exhaust. Every time I thought I had regained control, that I was safely focused on the road ahead, the melody would shift or intensify, pulling my consciousness back into that dreamy state where the boundaries between thought and reality became fluid and uncertain. I tried everything I could think of to break the spell, opening all the windows, cranking the radio to uncomfortable volumes, even slapping myself across the face hard enough to leave red marks. Nothing worked for more than a few minutes before the singing would reassert its hold on my attention, drawing me back into that dangerous reverie where truck and highway and music merged into a single flowing experience. As dawn approached and I finally descended from the mountain passes into the flatter terrain of eastern Colorado, the exhaust pipe song began to fade. Like a radio station gradually losing signal strength, the melody grew fainter and more intermittent, until only occasional wisps of music drifted back from the chrome stack. By the time I reached the distribution center to drop my load, the sound had returned to normal diesel exhaust rumble. I completed the delivery and found a nearby truck stop to grab some sleep before my next pickup. But rest didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear echoes of that haunting melody, and I found myself almost missing its ethereal beauty. Even now, weeks later, I sometimes catch myself listening for it during long nighttime runs through mountain country. The strangest part is that I've started asking other drivers about singing exhaust pipes, and you'd be surprised how many of them nod with recognition when I describe the experience. The brake that bleeds. From Marcus Gutermeikerns. I've been hauling freight across these highways for nearly 20 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Weather that could knock a rig sideways, mechanical failures in the middle of nowhere, and drivers who shouldn't be trusted with a bicycle, let alone an 18-wheeler. But nothing in all those years of driving prepared me for what happened on that rain-soaked night in northern Oregon when my brake pedal started bleeding. The evening had started ordinary enough. I was running a load of electronics from Portland down to Sacramento, my trusty Peterbilt 379 humming along Interstate 5 through the Cascade foothills. The weather had been threatening all day, with heavy clouds hanging low over the mountains like a gray wool blanket, and by the time I passed through Salem, the first drops were spattering against my windshield. The rhythmic sweep of the wipers and the steady drone of the diesel engine beneath me created that hypnotic soundtrack that every long-haul trucker knows by heart. I'd been pushing hard all day, trying to make good time before the storm hit in earnest. But by 9:30 the rain was coming down in sheets that made the highway lights blur into watercolor smears. The smart thing would have been to find a truck stop and wait it out, but I was behind schedule, and the customer was expecting their delivery first thing in the morning. Pride and stubbornness have always been my weaknesses, and that night they nearly cost me everything. The first sign something was wrong came just south of Eugene. I was downshifting to navigate a long curve when I felt the brake pedal sink slightly under my boot. Not unusual in itself, air brakes can be temperamental in wet weather, but something about the feel was different. There was a wetness to it, a squelching sensation that made me think of stepping in mud. I pumped the pedal a few times, and it seemed to firm up, so I convinced myself it was just condensation in the lines. This time when I looked down, I could swear I saw something dark seeping from around the edges of the brake pedal. The cab was dimly lit by the green glow of the dashboard, and the shadows were playing tricks with my eyes, but it looked almost like liquid was oozing up from the floorboard. I reached over and switched on the dome light, and what I saw made my stomach clench with unease. This was dark, almost black in the artificial light, with a consistency that seemed too thick to be hydraulic fluid. As I watched, another drop seemed to well up from somewhere beneath the pedal and fall with a soft plop onto the growing puddle. The smell that reached my nostrils was metallic and organic, like old pennies mixed with something that had been left too long in the sun. I pulled over at the next rest area, a lonely stretch of cracked asphalt surrounded by towering Douglas firs that swayed and creaked in the wind. The rain was still coming down hard, drumming against the roof of the cab, with an intensity that made normal conversation impossible. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove box and climbed down from the driver's seat, my boots splashing in puddles that reflected the truck's running lights like scattered coins. I checked brake lines thousands of times before, looking for leaks or wear spots that could cause a failure. But as I knelt beside the front wheel and played the beam of my flashlight over the brake components, I found myself looking at something that defied every bit of mechanical knowledge I'd accumulated over 2 decades of trucking. The brake lines appeared intact, with no signs of damage or wear. The fittings were tight, the hoses showed no cracking or bulging, and the brake chamber seemed to be functioning normally. But there was fluid dripping from somewhere, a steady drip, drip, drip that echoed hollowly in the space beneath the truck. I followed the drops upward with my flashlight beam, tracing them back toward their source, and found myself staring at what looked like a small puncture wound in the main brake line. The hole was perfectly round, about the size of a pencil eraser, and the edges were smooth rather than torn. More disturbing still, the fluid that was seeping from it moved with a sluggish, viscous quality that reminded me uncomfortably of blood from a fresh wound. As I watched, the flow would pulse slightly, as if responding to some internal pressure or rhythm. The metal was smooth and undamaged, and when I tried to wipe away some of the leaked fluid to get a better look, it felt warm against my skin despite the cold rain. The smell was stronger now, that metallic organic scent that made me think of the butcher shop my grandfather had run when I was a child. The logical part of my mind insisted it had to be some kind of brake fluid I wasn't familiar with. Maybe a new synthetic blend that had different properties than the standard DOT, but the feel of it on my fingers was wrong, and the way it had pulsed as it dripped from that perfectly round hole kept replaying in my memory like a disturbing film loop. It was 47 miles to a travel center outside of Cottage Grove, and with the brakes potentially compromised, every mile would be a gamble. But staying parked at this isolated rest stop until morning didn't feel like an option either. Something about the way the trees seemed to press in around the edges of the parking area, and the fact that I hadn't seen another vehicle pass in over an hour, made me want to get back on the highway despite the mechanical issue. The rain had eased slightly by the time I pulled back onto Interstate 5, but the road surface was still slick with water and fallen leaves. I kept my speed down and tested the brakes gently every few minutes, trying to get a feel for how much stopping power I had left. Each time I pressed the pedal, I could feel that strange wetness beneath my boot, and I began to imagine I could hear a faint squelching sound over the noise of the engine and road. 10 miles down the highway, the sensation in the brake pedal began to change. Instead of the firm resistance I was used to, it started to feel spongy and unpredictable. Sometimes it would catch normally, bringing the big rig down smoothly through the gears, but other times it would sink nearly to the floor with a wet, organic feeling that made my skin crawl. Worse still, I began to notice that the dark fluid was spreading across the floorboard of the cab, creating a puddle that seemed to grow larger every time I glanced down. The smell was getting stronger too, that metallic blood-like odor that now filled the entire cab despite the fresh air I was pulling in through the vents. I opened the driver's side window a crack to try to clear the air, but the rain and wind that came in only seemed to intensify the smell rather than dissipate it. It was as if the odor was coming from inside the truck itself, seeping up from some source I couldn't locate or eliminate. By the time I reached the long downgrade that led into the Willamette Valley, I knew I was in serious trouble. The brake pedal had become completely unpredictable, sometimes responding normally and sometimes sinking to the floor with that horrible wet sensation. The dark fluid was now covering most of the driver's side floorboard, and in the green glow of the dashboard lights, it looked disturbingly like congealed blood. The grade was steep and the pavement was still slick with rain, and I could feel the momentum of 40 tons of truck and cargo trying to push me faster than my remaining brakes could safely handle. My hands were sweating despite the cool air in the cab, and I had to fight the urge to ride the brake pedal, knowing that overheating what was left of the brake system would leave me with no stopping power at all. That's when I heard it for the first time, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the floorboard. A wet, rhythmic pulsing that reminded me of a heartbeat. At first I thought it was just the air compressor cycling, or maybe some vibration in the brake lines, but as I listened more carefully, I realized it had an organic quality that no mechanical system could produce. It was as if something living was trapped beneath the truck, pumping fluid through the brake system with each beat of its heart. The Midnight Special. From Jake Henley. The thing about driving long haul is that time becomes fluid after midnight, stretching and contracting like taffy in the summer heat. I'd been running freight between Portland and Denver for going on 15 years, and I thought I knew every truck stop, every all-night diner, every lonely stretch of asphalt between the Pacific Northwest and the Rockies. That's what made finding Mabel's such a peculiar thing. It was pushing 2 in the morning when I spotted the neon glow cutting through the October drizzle somewhere outside Burns, Oregon. The sign flickered in that familiar pattern of dying electricity, casting pink and blue light across the wet pavement like spilled paint. Mabel's Diner, it read, with a smaller sign beneath promising hot coffee and fresh pie 24 hours. My Peterbilt's fuel gauge was hovering just above a quarter tank, and my stomach had been growling for the better part of an hour, so I downshifted and pulled into the gravel lot beside 2 other rigs and a handful of weather-beaten cars. The rain drummed a steady rhythm against my windshield as I killed the engine, the sudden silence feeling almost oppressive after 12 hours of road noise and diesel rumble. Through the diner's wide windows, I could see warm yellow light spilling across empty booths and a counter lined with chrome stools. A lone waitress moved between the tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been working the graveyard shift for years, her movements deliberate and unhurried. I pulled on my jacket and made a dash through the drizzle, the bell above the door chiming my arrival with a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The diner had that timeless quality that truck stops often possess, all worn vinyl and formica, the kind of place that could have existed unchanged for decades. The smell of coffee and bacon grease hung in the air, mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify, something that reminded me of old books and forgotten places. The waitress looked up from wiping down a table and smiled, her face kind but tired in the way that spoke of too many late nights and early morning. She was maybe 50, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that held the particular brand of weariness that comes with serving coffee to strangers in the small hours of the night. "Please," I said, sliding onto one of the chrome stools. The vinyl seat was cracked but comfortable, worn smooth by countless truckers and late-night travelers. "And maybe a look at your menu if you don't mind." She poured the coffee with practiced ease, the steam rising from the cup like incense in the fluorescent light. "Fresh pot," she said. "Made it maybe 20 minutes ago. Kitchen's still open if you're hungry. We've got meatloaf tonight, and apple pie that came out of the oven around 11. The coffee was good, hot and strong without being bitter, and I found myself relaxing for the first time in hours. It was then that I noticed the clock on the wall behind the counter, an old schoolhouse model with Roman numerals and ornate hands that looked like they belonged in a different century. The time showed 1:47, which seemed about right, though I could have sworn it had been closer to 2 when I'd pulled in. "At night," I commented, glancing around the nearly empty diner. "They usually are this time of year," the waitress replied. Her name tag read Dolores. "Summer's different, Lots of folks heading to the coast or up to Seattle. But come October, it's mostly just us regulars, and the occasional trucker like yourself. Usually I ordered the meatloaf and a slice of pie, and Dolores disappeared into the kitchen with my order. The diner settled into the comfortable quiet that comes with late-night solitude, broken only by the soft hiss of the coffee pot and the distant rumble of a truck pulling back onto the highway. I found my gaze drifting to the clock again, noting that the hands now showed. Strange, I thought, though not strange enough to worry about. Clocks in places like this were notoriously unreliable. The meatloaf arrived steaming hot, accompanied by mashed potatoes and green beans that tasted like they'd been made from scratch. Dolores refilled my coffee cup and settled behind the counter with a magazine, giving me space to eat in peace. It was comfortable, the kind of simple pleasure that made the long hours on the road worthwhile. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and I felt no urge to hurry back to my cab. The hands now pointed to 1:43, and I felt a small chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. I stared at the timepiece for a long moment, waiting to see if the minute hand would move forward, but it remained stubbornly fixed. Clock must be broken, I reasoned, though something about that explanation felt insufficient. "Excuse me," I called to Dolores, who looked up from her magazine with a questioning expression. "Your clock there, behind the counter. It seems to be running backward." She turned to look at the timepiece, her expression neutral. "Oh, that old thing," she said with a slight smile. "It's been acting up for years. We keep meaning to get it fixed, but somehow we never get around to it." Her tone was casual, but there was something in her eyes that didn't quite match the lightness of her words. I found myself studying the clock more intently, watching as the minute hand moved with deliberate precision from one. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, each tick carrying the second hand in the wrong direction around the dial. "That's quite a malfunction," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Time's funny in places like this," Dolores replied, turning back to her magazine. "Especially at night. Sometimes it feels like it barely moves at all, and other times it seems to slip away when you're not looking." I finished my meatloaf in silence, stealing glances at the backward clock. The hands continued their reverse journey, and with each passing minute that moved in the wrong direction, I felt a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite explain. The diner, which had felt warm and welcoming when I'd arrived, now seemed to press in around me with a weight that was almost physical. The apple pie was excellent, flaky crust and perfectly spiced filling that should have been comforting. Instead, I found myself eating mechanically, my attention focused on the relentless backward movement of the clock hands. 1:40, 1:39, 1:38. Each tick seemed louder than the last, though I knew that was impossible over the ambient noise of the diner. "How long has it been doing that?" I asked, nodding toward the clock. Dolores looked up again, following my gaze. "Oh, years now. Maybe since I started working here. Come to think of it, the owners mentioned getting it repaired, but it's become something of a conversation starter. Folks remember a place with a backward clock. When did you start working here?" "When you work nights, the days all start to run together." There was something unsettling about her answer, a vagueness that felt deliberate rather than casual. I found myself studying her more closely, noting details I'd missed before. Her uniform, while clean, had the faded quality of fabric that had been washed countless times. Her hands, wrapped around her coffee cup, seemed older than her face suggested, marked with lines and spots that spoke of decades rather than years. The clock now read 1:35, and I felt a growing urgency to leave that I couldn't rationally explain. The backward movement of time seemed to create a pressure in my chest, as if the normal flow of causality was being disrupted in ways that my mind couldn't fully process. I glanced at my phone, noting that it showed 2:18, which meant I'd been in the diner for over half an hour. Yet according to the wall clock, time had moved backward by 12 minutes. Still got a lot of miles to cover before dawn. Of course, Dolores said, moving to the register with fluid grace. That'll be $12.50 for the meal, and the coffee's on the house. First-time customer discount. I handed her a 20, noticing that her fingers were cold when they brushed mine. The register was an old mechanical model that rang up the sale with a satisfying mechanical chime. When the road knows where you're going. From Marcus Chen T. The timestamp in the corner of my dash cam reads February 15th, 2029. But that can't be right. Today is February 15th, 2027. I've checked my phone, my GPS, even the calendar on my tablet, and they all confirm it. Yet, there it sits in the bottom right corner of the footage I'm watching back, glowing in those familiar green digits 2 years ahead of where it should be. I drive long haul for Morrison Freight. Been doing it for 8 years now, and I've seen my share of strange things on America's highways. Phantom hitchhikers that vanish when you look twice. Lights in the sky that move too purposefully to be planes. Rest stops that seem to exist only when you're desperate enough to need them. But this is different. This is my own truck, my own route, my own voice on the audio, living through something I haven't experienced yet. The footage starts normally enough. I'm heading west on Interstate 80 through Nebraska, the endless cornfields stretching away into darkness on either side. The hum of my Peterbilt's engine creates that familiar white noise that's been my companion for countless nights, and I can hear myself humming along to a song on the radio. The headlights cut through the February gloom, illuminating the broken center line that disappears beneath my hood in an endless rhythm. It's peaceful, meditative even, the kind of drive that lets your mind wander while your hands do the work they've done 10,000 times before. But then I notice the differences, subtle at first. The CB radio crackles with chatter from drivers I don't recognize, talking about routes that don't exist and truck stops I've never heard of. There's mention of the new automated weigh stations on Highway 30. But Highway 30 doesn't have automated weigh stations. There's talk of the fuel shortage in Colorado, but there's no fuel shortage. At least, not in my... On the dashcam screen, I watch myself reach for the CB handset, and I remember the chill that runs down my spine as I hear my own voice asking about these strange references. The responses come back matter-of-fact, casual, as if everyone on the channel exists in this same shifted timeline except me. A driver with the handle, Night Owl, mentions the new electric charging stations in Wyoming, and when I ask him to repeat that, there's a long pause before he responds that maybe I should get my radio checked. The miles roll by, and the timestamp keeps its steady advance into a future that hasn't happened yet. I watch myself stop for fuel at a truck stop that I know well, Morrison's Travel Plaza outside of North Platte, but on the screen it's different. The layout is the same, but there are charging bays for electric trucks where the repair shop should be. The convenience store has been expanded, and there are signs advertising brands I don't recognize. The fuel prices on the LED display are astronomical, nearly $3 higher per gallon than they should be. I remember this stop now, or rather, I remember it happening in my future. I watched myself walk into the store, and the clerk behind the counter was someone I'd never seen before. A young woman with intricate tattoos covering her arms and a small device embedded behind her right ear that pulsed with a soft blue light. She greeted me like an old friend, asked about my run to Sacramento, mentioned that the weather in the Sierra Nevada was getting worse, and I should be careful of the new mudslide zones. When I asked her about the device behind her ear, she looked at me strangely and said everyone had gotten their neural interfaces installed when the mandate went through last spring. The way she said it suggested this was common knowledge, something as mundane as renewing your commercial driver's license. But there was no mandate in my timeline, no neural interfaces, no casual acceptance of technology that seemed pulled from a science fiction novel. Back on the road, the differences multiplied. The GPS in my truck began announcing turns for highways that didn't exist, detours around construction projects I couldn't see. When I ignored the instructions and continued on my familiar route, the device seemed to argue with me, recalculating again and again with increasing urgency. The voice became more insistent, almost plaintive, as if it couldn't understand why I wasn't following directions to avoid delays that were apparently obvious to everyone but me. Other trucks began appearing in my mirrors, models I didn't recognize with sleek, aerodynamic designs and silent running lights that pulsed in patterns rather than staying steady. They maintained perfect spacing, moved with an almost choreographed precision that spoke of computer assistance, and when I tried to break into their convoy, they adjusted their positions to accommodate me with an efficiency that felt distinctly inhuman. The CB chatter grew stranger as the night progressed. Drivers discussed routes that took them through cities I'd never heard of, complained about regulations that made no sense in my world, and spoke casually about family members who lived in places that didn't exist on my map. When I tried to join their conversations, my questions were met with confusion and eventually silence, as if I were speaking a dialect they could almost but not quite understand. Around midnight, according to the timestamp that insisted it was 2029, I approached a way station that definitely hadn't been there during my last run through this stretch of highway. The structure was all glass and steel, illuminated from within by a cold white light that made it look more like a laboratory than a DOT facility. Autonomous systems scanned my truck as I rolled onto the platform, and I could hear the computers communicating with systems in my cab that I knew I didn't have. Sensors mapped every inch of my trailer, analyzed my cargo manifest, and cross-referenced my identity against databases that seemed to know more about me than I knew about myself. When the process completed, a synthesized voice informed me that my vehicle was compliant with regulations that wouldn't be implemented for another 3 years, and wished me a safe journey to a destination I hadn't told anyone about. The miles after the way station took on a dreamlike quality. The landscape outside my windows began to shift in subtle ways, as if the familiar geography of Nebraska was being rewritten while I drove through it. Farmhouses appeared where I remembered empty fields, wind farms sprouted from hills that had been barren, and the very shape of the horizon seemed to adjust itself to accommodate a world that was almost but not quite the one I knew. My fuel gauge became a source of constant anxiety. It showed levels that didn't match my calculations, consumption rates that defied the known efficiency of my engine. When I stopped to fill up again, the pump dispensed a fluid that looked like diesel but had an odd, oily rainbow sheen that caught the sodium vapor lights in ways that seemed to bend physics. The credit card reader accepted my payment but displayed a transaction date 2 years in the future, and the receipt it printed was for fuel purchased by someone with my name, but a different DOT number. As dawn approached on the timestamp, though my watch insisted it was still the deep of night, the radio began picking up news broadcasts from this shifted world. The reports spoke of economic changes that had reshaped the trucking industry, of technologies that had revolutionized transportation, of social transformations that had evolved gradually over months I had never lived through. The newscasters mentioned events as historical fact that I knew had never occurred, referenced public figures I'd never heard of, and discussed the impacts of legislation that had never been proposed in my timeline. The most unsettling moment came when the news anchor began reading traffic reports for my exact location. She warned of delays on Interstate 80 westbound due to an overturned vehicle near mile marker 285. Exactly where I was approaching. I slowed down, scanned the road ahead with nervous attention, but saw nothing unusual. The highway stretched empty and clear in both directions, peaceful under the pre-dawn gray that was beginning to touch the eastern sky. The overturned vehicle exactly as described, emergency lights flashing in the growing light. It was a truck much like mine, its trailer jackknifed across both westbound lanes. Emergency responders worked around it with the efficient urgency of professionals, and as I was directed into the single open lane, I caught sight of the accident victim being loaded into an ambulance. Not someone who looked like me, not someone wearing similar clothes, but me with absolute certainty. Same face, same build, same scar on my left hand from a loading accident 3 years ago. Our eyes met for just a moment as I rolled past, and there was a recognition there, a shared understanding of something too strange and terrible to process. I pulled over at the next truck stop, hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what I'd witnessed. The dash cam had recorded it all, but when I played back the footage, the timestamp had returned to normal. February 15th, 2027. Exactly as it should be. The accident scene was there, but now it showed a different truck, a different driver, a routine mishap that had nothing to do with me. Ashes to ashes. From Marcus Wheeler, the CB radio crackled with static as I pulled into the Sunset Mesa truck stop, somewhere deep in the Nevada desert where the mountains looked like broken teeth against the star-drunk sky. My rig, a midnight blue Peterbilt that had been my home for the better part of 15 years, wheezed to a stop with the kind of mechanical sigh that comes from too many miles and not enough maintenance. The fuel gauge needle sat just above empty, that familiar red zone that every long-haul driver knows like an old enemy. It was past 2 in the morning, and the truck stop had that hollow, fluorescent lit quality that makes everything look like a horror movie set. The attendant inside the glass booth was reading a paperback novel, his face ghostly pale under the buzzing lights. A few other rigs sat scattered across the lot like sleeping giants, their chrome bumpers catching fragments of neon from the diner sign that blinked open 24 hours in letters that had seen better decades. I'd been running loads between Phoenix and Salt Lake City for 3 months now, the same route over and over, carrying everything from electronics to furniture for a logistics company that paid just enough to keep me rolling. The desert highways had become as familiar as my own reflection. Every mile marker and rest stop burned into my memory like brands on cowhide. But tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the dry desert air. The fuel pump clicked and hummed as I filled the tanks, the numbers on the digital display rolling upward in their steady rhythm. Diesel fuel has its own particular smell, sharp and oily, but tonight there was something else mixed in with it, something that reminded me of wood smoke and autumn leaves. I figured it was just my imagination, the product of too many hours staring at endless asphalt and too much truck stop coffee. Back in the cab, I settled into the driver's seat and fired up the engine. The Caterpillar motor turned over smooth as silk, purring with that deep, satisfied rumble that tells you everything's running right. I pulled back onto the highway, the truck stop's lights fading in my mirrors as I merged into the eastbound lanes of Interstate 8. The road stretched ahead like a black ribbon, empty except for the occasional pair of headlights in the distance. About 20 miles out from the truck stop, the engine started making a sound I'd never heard before, a subtle wheeze that seemed to come from deep in the motor's chest. It wasn't the usual diesel knock or the whistle of a turbocharger. This was something softer, more organic, like breathe. I checked the gauges, but everything looked normal. Oil pressure good, coolant temperature steady, fuel flowing fine. Still, the sound persisted, a rhythmic wheeze that seemed to match the rhythm of my own breathing. The radio played an old country song about lost love and empty highways, the singer's voice crackling through the speakers with the kind of melancholy that only comes out after midnight. I turned the volume down and listened more carefully to the engine, trying to isolate that strange sound. It was definitely coming from somewhere near the fuel system, maybe the injector pump or the fuel lines themselves. I'd had trucks make stranger noises and run for another 100,000 miles. But something about this particular sound made the hair on my arms stand up. By the time I reached the long grade that climbs up toward the Utah border, the wheeze had gotten worse and the engine was starting to lose power. I downshifted and watched the exhaust temperature gauge climb toward the red zone. The truck was working harder than it should have been, struggling up the grade like it was pulling twice its normal weight. Through the windshield I could see my exhaust stack in the side mirror, and instead of the usual black diesel smoke, something pale and gray was drifting up into the desert night. I pulled over at a scenic overlook, one of those spots where tourists stop during the day to take pictures of the vast emptiness. The parking area was cracked and weathered, with tumbleweeds caught against a chain-link fence and a historical marker that had been sandblasted clean by decades of desert wind. I left the engine running and walked around to the passenger side, where I could get a better look at the exhaust. What I saw made my blood run cold. Instead of the normal black diesel exhaust, a steady stream of fine gray ash was flowing from the stack, drifting up into the night sky like smoke from a crematorium. The ash was so fine it looked almost like powder, and it had an odd quality to it, the way it seemed to swirl and dance in patterns that defied the gentle desert breeze. I reached up and caught some of it in my palm, and it felt warm, warmer than it should have been, with a texture like ground bone. Everything looked normal at first, the big Caterpillar motor sitting there like a mechanical heart, all chrome and steel and purposeful engineering. But when I traced the fuel lines from the tank to the injection pump, I found something that made my hands start shaking. The fuel lines were clogged with ash, the same gray powder that had been coming out of the exhaust stack. I could see it through the translucent fuel filter, a thick sludge that looked more like cremated remains than diesel fuel. The ash was moving through the system, flowing like liquid toward the engine, and I realized with growing horror that my truck had been running on this gray powder for the last 20 miles. I disconnected the fuel line at the filter housing and pointed my flashlight into the opening. Instead of the clear amber color of clean diesel, I saw nothing but ash, fine gray powder that seemed to shimmer in the beam of my flashlight. The smell hit me then, not the sharp petroleum smell of diesel fuel, but something organic and familiar, like a wood fire that had burned down to nothing but memories. My hands were shaking as I reconnected the fuel line and closed the hood. There was no way the truck should have been running at all with ash in the fuel system, but the engine was still idling smoothly, that strange wheeze the only sign that anything was wrong. I climbed back into the cab and sat there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The CB radio crackled to life, breaking the desert silence with a burst of static. A voice came through the speaker, faint and scratchy, like it was coming from very far away. "Eastbound Peterbilt, you got your ears on?" The voice was familiar somehow, though I couldn't place it. Old, tired, with the kind of roughness that comes from too many cigarettes and too many years on the road. I picked up the microphone, my voice catching in my throat. "Yeah, this is the Eastbound Pete. Go ahead. You having some fuel troubles there, driver?" The voice crackled through the static, and I could hear something like laughter in the background, though it might have been just interference. There were no other trucks in sight, no headlights or taillights, just the empty desert stretching away into darkness. "Oh, I know about it, all right," the voice said. "Been burning that same fuel for longer than I care to remember. Ash burns clean, you know. Burns real clean, leaves nothing behind but more ash." I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm desert air. "Who is this? Where are you?" Had myself a real nice Kenworth, green as spring grass, burned up in a fuel fire just outside of Wendover. Truck and driver both. Nothing left but ash and metal. The static grew louder, and I thought I could hear other voices mixed in with it. A whole chorus of truckers calling out over the radio waves, names and dates, CB handles and last known positions, all of them fading in and out, like distant stations on a car radio. "The thing about ash," Tommy Holbrook's voice continued, "is that it never really goes away. It just gets mixed in with everything else, becomes part of the fuel, part of the road, part of the whole damn system. And sometimes, when conditions are just right, it starts moving again." I looked at the fuel gauge and realized with growing terror that it hadn't moved since I'd left the truck stop. The needle still showed 3/4 full, even though the engine had been running for over an hour. The ash in the fuel lines was somehow sustaining itself, feeding the engine with the remains of drivers who had died on this stretch of highway decades ago. "You got two choices," the voice said, and the static was getting so bad I could barely make out the word. "You can keep running on our fuel, become part of the ash yourself, join the convoy that never stops, or you can try to make it to the next truck stop."